Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we're traveling to Sarasota, Florida, to explore a case that shook a quiet community and ultimately led to significant changes in how we protect our children. This is the story of 11-year-old Carly Brucia, a case that unfolded on a February evening in 2004, captured on surveillance footage that would become pivotal evidence in a criminal investigation. As you settle in for the night, let me take you back to that Sunday, February 1, 2004. It was Super Bowl Sunday, a day when millions of Americans were gathering around television sets, preparing for the big game between the New England Patriots and the Carolina Panthers. But in the quiet suburban streets of Sarasota, Florida, a much smaller, more personal story was about to unfold, one that would capture the attention of the entire nation. Carly Jane Brucia was an 11-year-old girl with a bright smile and the kind of energy that comes with youth. She had spent the afternoon at her friend's house, enjoying what should have been a perfectly ordinary Sunday. The sun was beginning to set over Sarasota, casting long shadows across the residential streets lined with palm trees and modest Florida homes. At approximately 6:10 in the evening, Carly said goodbye to her friend and began the short walk home. It was a route she had taken many times before, a simple journey through her neighborhood that should have taken no more than 15 or 20 minutes. The air was warm, typical for February in Florida, and there was nothing to suggest that this evening would be different from any other. Carly's parents expected her home soon. Like many families, they had established routines and boundaries that balanced giving their daughter independence with keeping her safe. The walk from her friend's house was considered safe, a quiet area where neighbors knew each other and children could move about without constant worry. But as the minutes ticked by past 6:30, then 7 o'clock, concern began to creep into the Brucia household. Carly was typically responsible about being home when expected. When she didn't arrive by the agreed-upon time, her parents began to feel that particular type of worry that starts in the stomach and slowly spreads, the kind that tells you something isn't right. By 6:45 p.m., Carly's mother, Susan Shorpen, made the decision that many parents dread but hope they'll never have to make. She called the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office to report her daughter missing. In many missing person cases, law enforcement agencies have policies about waiting periods, but when the missing person is a child, those protocols change dramatically. The deputies who responded to the call understood the urgency. They began canvassing the area immediately, going door to door, asking neighbors if they had seen anything unusual, if they had noticed a young girl walking alone, if anything had struck them as out of place on this quiet Sunday evening. As word spread through the neighborhood, more people joined the search. Volunteers emerged from their homes, many still wearing the casual clothes they donned for watching the Super Bowl. The game continued on television screens across America, but in Sarasota, a different kind of urgency had taken hold. Search teams formed naturally. Some people checked local parks, others walked the streets with flashlights as darkness fell. Everyone hoped for the best possible outcome, that Carly had simply gotten distracted, perhaps stopped to talk with friends, maybe lost track of time. These were the scenarios people clung to in those first hours, the explanations that would mean everything was still okay. But as Sunday night stretched toward Monday morning, hope began to mix with a deeper, more troubling fear. In the early hours of the investigation, detectives began the methodical process of checking security cameras along Carly's anticipated route home. This is standard procedure in missing person cases, investigators traced the last known path, looking for any visual evidence that might provide clues about what happened. It was during this process that investigators made a discovery that would change everything. At Evie's car wash on Bee Ridge Road, there was a surveillance camera, and when detectives reviewed the footage from Sunday evening, they found something that made their blood run cold. The timestamp on the recording showed 6:21 p.m. There, captured in grainy but unmistakable detail, was 11-year-old Carly Brucia walking past the car wash. She appeared to be alone, walking at a normal pace, seemingly unaware of any danger. But then, a figure appeared in the frame. The man looked to be in his late 20s or early 30s. He approached Carly, and the two appeared to have a brief conversation. For a moment, investigators watching the footage might have hoped this was simply someone giving directions, a helpful stranger pointing the way. But what happened next eliminated any innocent explanation. The man reached out and grabbed Carly by the arm. Even through the grainy surveillance footage, even without audio, the body language was unmistakable. This was not a consensual interaction. Carly's posture, the way she seemed to resist, the man's firm grip, all of it pointed to one terrible conclusion: they were witnessing an abduction in progress. The footage showed the man leading Carly away from the camera's view, disappearing into the growing darkness of that February evening. It was 6:21 p.m., and these would be the last images of Carly Brucia alive. When the surveillance footage was discovered on Monday morning, the investigation shifted into high gear. What had been a missing person case was now clearly an abduction, and time was of the essence. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing with them additional resources and expertise in kidnapping cases. The grainy surveillance footage was enhanced using the best technology available in 2004. NASA even assisted in the effort, using their advanced imaging capabilities to try to extract every possible detail from the recording. Investigators studied the man's clothing, his gait, his approximate height and build, looking for anything that might help identify him. The footage was released to the media, and within hours, it was being broadcast on television screens across the country. The image of a man grabbing a young girl became one of those moments that crystallizes in the public consciousness, stark, disturbing, and impossible to forget. Tips began pouring into the sheriff's office. People who thought they recognized the man, people who had seen suspicious activity, people who wanted to help in any way they could. Each tip had to be investigated, each lead followed, even as precious time continued to tick away. The search expanded beyond the immediate neighborhood. Helicopters flew overhead, search dogs were brought in, and volunteers combed through wooded areas and vacant lots. Everyone involved in the search understood that they were racing against time, that each hour that passed decreased the likelihood of finding Carly alive. Among the many tips that came in during those first crucial days, one would prove to be the key to solving the case. Someone who had seen the surveillance footage recognized the man in the video. They provided investigators with a name: Joseph P. Smith. Joseph Smith was 37 years old, a mechanic who had been struggling with drug addiction for years. He had a criminal history that included drug-related offenses, and he was known to law enforcement. When investigators learned his identity, they immediately began building a profile of where he might be and what he might have done. Smith lived in the Sarasota area and was familiar with the neighborhood where Carly had been abducted. He had been in and out of trouble with the law, mostly for drug-related crimes, but he had never been convicted of a violent offense. However, investigators knew that criminal behavior often escalates, and someone desperate enough to kidnap a child was capable of anything. The search for Joseph Smith began immediately. Law enforcement agencies coordinated their efforts, checking his known addresses, talking to his associates, and monitoring locations where he might appear. They understood that finding Smith quickly was their best hope of finding Carly alive. But even as the investigation focused on identifying and locating Smith, the search for Carly continued. Volunteers maintained their efforts, search teams covered more ground, and the entire community held on to hope that somehow, despite the frightening surveillance footage, Carly might still be found safe. On Friday, February 6, 4 days after Carly's abduction, the worst fears of everyone involved in the search were confirmed. Her body was found behind Central Church of Christ on Proctor Road in Sarasota, not far from where she had been taken. The discovery brought an end to the desperate search efforts, but it marked the beginning of a different kind of investigation. This was now a homicide case, and every piece of evidence would be crucial in building a case against Joseph Smith. The medical examiner's findings would later reveal the horrific details of Carly's final hours. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered, crimes that represented every parent's worst nightmare. The innocence of an 11-year-old girl had been violently taken away, and a family was left to grapple with an unimaginable loss. News of the discovery spread quickly through the community and across the nation. The case had captured widespread attention because of the surveillance footage, and people who had been following the story felt a personal connection to the outcome. The hopes and prayers of thousands of strangers had been focused on finding Carly alive, and the news of her death was felt far beyond the borders of Sarasota. Joseph Smith was arrested shortly after Carly's body was discovered. When law enforcement officers found him, he was reportedly under the influence of drugs, continuing the pattern of addiction that had marked his adult life. His arrest brought some measure of relief to a community that had been on edge since the abduction, but it could not undo the tragedy that had already occurred. During questioning, Smith initially denied involvement in Carly's disappearance and death. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. The surveillance footage clearly showed him taking Carly, and additional forensic evidence would further link him to the crime. As details of Smith's background emerged, a picture developed of a man whose life had been derailed by drug addiction. He had been in and out of the criminal justice system, had struggled to maintain employment despite his skills as a mechanic, and had been living a chaotic lifestyle that involved regular drug use. Those who knew Smith expressed shock that he could have committed such a violent crime. While he had a history of drug-related offenses, nothing in his past suggested he was capable of kidnapping and murdering a child. But investigators and criminal psychologists know that drug addiction can lead people to commit acts they never would have considered when sober, and desperation can drive individuals to cross lines they never imagined they would cross. The case against Joseph Smith moved through the criminal justice system with the kind of attention that high-profile cases often receive. The prosecution had significant evidence to work with, the surveillance footage showing Smith taking Carly, forensic evidence linking him to the crime, and his own eventual admissions about what had happened. Smith was charged with first-degree murder, sexual battery, and kidnapping. In Florida, first-degree murder charges in cases involving children can result in the death penalty, and prosecutors made it clear they would seek the ultimate punishment for Smith's crimes. The trial, which took place in 2005, was closely watched by the media and the public. The surveillance footage that had been crucial in identifying Smith was shown repeatedly during the proceedings, serving as stark visual evidence of the crime in progress. During the trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a man whose drug addiction had led him to commit increasingly desperate acts. They argued that Smith had taken Carly with the intention of sexually assaulting her, and that he had killed her to prevent her from identifying him. The defense faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against Smith was overwhelming, and the surveillance footage made denial futile. Instead, defense attorneys focused on Smith's drug addiction and mental health issues, hoping to convince the jury to spare his life even if they found him guilty of the charges. After deliberating for 5 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges against Joseph Smith. The evidence had been too strong, the case too clear-cut for any other outcome. Smith was convicted of first-degree murder, sexual battery, and kidnapping in connection with Carly Brucius' death. The penalty phase of the trial then began, during which the same jury would decide whether Smith should be sentenced to life in prison or death. This phase involved testimony about Smith's background, his struggles with addiction, and the impact of his crimes on Carly's family and the community. Carly's family members spoke about their loss, describing a bright, energetic girl whose life had been cut short by a senseless act of violence. They talked about the hole her death had left in their lives, the milestones she would never reach, and the pain that would never fully heal. In December 2005, the jury voted 10-2 in favor of the death penalty for Joseph Smith. Under Florida law at the time, the final sentencing decision rested with the judge, but the jury's recommendation carried significant weight. The judge ultimately sentenced Smith to death for the murder of Carly Brucia. The murder of Carly Brucia had an impact that extended far beyond the criminal courtroom. The case highlighted gaps in the criminal justice system, particularly regarding how offenders with histories of drug-related crimes were monitored and supervised. One of the most significant outcomes was the introduction of Carly's Law in the U.S. Congress. This legislation, introduced by Representative Katherine Harris with bipartisan support, aimed to strengthen the monitoring of sex offenders and improve coordination between law enforcement agencies when tracking dangerous individuals. The law focused on improving the National Sex Offender Registry and ensuring that information about dangerous offenders was shared more effectively between different jurisdictions. While Smith had not been convicted of sex crimes before killing Carly, legislators recognized that his case illustrated the need for better tracking of individuals who posed potential threats to children. The surveillance footage from Evie's car wash also led to increased awareness about the importance of security cameras in public spaces. Many businesses and communities upgraded their security systems in the aftermath of Carly's case, recognizing that such footage could be crucial in solving crimes and protecting children. After his conviction and death sentence, Joseph Smith was transferred to Florida's death row, where he would spend the remaining years of his life. Death row inmates in Florida are housed at Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, where they live in isolation while their cases go through the lengthy appeals process that accompanies all death penalty cases. Smith's case went through various appeals, as is standard in death penalty cases. His attorneys argued various points of law, challenged aspects of the trial proceedings, and sought to have his sentence commuted to life in prison. However, none of these appeals were successful in overturning his conviction or changing his sentence. During his time on death row, Smith's case occasionally returned to the news, usually in connection with legal developments or anniversaries of Carly's death. The surveillance footage continued to be referenced in discussions about child safety and the importance of security cameras, and Carly's story remained part of the broader conversation about protecting children from predators. The legal landscape around death penalty cases was also changing during Smith's years on death row. The U.S. Supreme Court issued several rulings that affected how death sentences were imposed and reviewed, and some of these changes had implications for Smith's case and others like it. In Sarasota, the memory of Carly Brucia remained vivid long after the initial shock of her death had faded. The community had come together during the search for her, and that sense of collective concern and responsibility continued in various forms over the years. Memorial events were held on anniversaries of her death, serving both to honor her memory and to remind the community about the importance of child safety. Local schools and community organizations used her story as a teaching tool, helping children understand the importance of being aware of their surroundings and the potential dangers that could exist even in familiar neighborhoods. The car wash where Carly was abducted became an informal memorial site, where people would sometimes leave flowers or other tributes. The surveillance camera that had captured the crucial footage was eventually replaced with updated technology, but the importance of that original recording was never forgotten. Parents in the community found themselves having difficult conversations with their children about personal safety in the aftermath of Carly's death. The case had shown that danger could appear anywhere, even on familiar streets in broad daylight, and families had to balance teaching awareness and caution without creating paralyzing fear. On July 26, 2021, more than 17 years after Carly Brucia's murder, Joseph Smith died while on death row at Union Correctional Institution. He was 60 years old at the time of his death, and he had been facing a potential resentencing hearing that might have changed his death sentence to life in prison due to changes in Florida's death penalty statutes. Smith's death brought a form of closure to a case that had haunted the Sarasota community for nearly 2 decades. While it could never undo the tragedy of Carly's death or heal the wounds left by her loss, it did mean that her killer would never again pose a threat to anyone. The announcement of Smith's death prompted renewed coverage of the case, with many news outlets revisiting the surveillance footage that had been so crucial in solving the crime. For those who remembered the case when it first happened, Smith's death served as a reminder of how much time had passed and how the case had affected not just Carly's family, but an entire community. State Attorney Ed Brodsky, who had prosecuted the case, released a statement acknowledging Smith's death and reflecting on the impact of the case. He noted that while nothing could bring Carly back, her case had led to important changes in how the criminal justice system approaches similar crimes and how communities work to protect their children. The case of Carly Brucia offers several important lessons about child safety, the role of technology in solving crimes, and the way communities respond to tragedy. The surveillance footage that captured her abduction demonstrated the crucial role that security cameras can play in criminal investigations, leading many businesses and communities to invest in better security systems. The case also highlighted the unpredictable nature of violent crime. Joseph Smith had never been convicted of violent offenses before killing Carly, reminding us that criminal behavior can escalate in unexpected ways. This unpredictability makes it difficult to prevent all such crimes, but it also underscores the importance of community awareness and vigilance. For parents, Carly's case serves as a sobering reminder that even familiar, seemingly safe environments can harbor dangers. The balance between teaching children to be independent and keeping them safe is one that every family must navigate, and cases like Carly's inform those difficult decisions. The legislative changes that followed Carly's death, including the introduction of Carly's Law, showed how individual tragedies can lead to broader systemic improvements. While these changes came too late to save Carly, they may have helped protect other children from similar fates. Today, nearly 20 years after Carly Brucia's death, her case remains relevant in discussions about child safety and criminal justice. The surveillance footage continues to be referenced in training for law enforcement officers and in educational materials about child protection. The case also serves as a reminder of the importance of community involvement in keeping children safe. The volunteers who searched for Carly, the tipsters who helped identify her abductor, and the ongoing efforts to remember her story all demonstrate how communities can come together in the face of tragedy. For Carly's family, the pain of her loss remains, but her story continues to serve a purpose in protecting other children. The legislative changes, increased awareness, and improved security measures that followed her death represent a form of legacy, a way that her brief life continues to have meaning and impact. As we reflect on Carly's story, we're reminded of the preciousness of childhood innocence and the responsibility we all share in protecting it. Her case shows us both the worst that humans are capable of and the best, the way communities come together, the dedication of law enforcement officers, and the persistence of those who work to prevent such tragedies from happening again. The surveillance footage that captured Carly's final moments remains one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in criminal justice history. But beyond its value as evidence, it serves as a powerful reminder of how quickly life can change, how important it is to cherish the time we have with our loved ones, and how crucial it is for all of us to remain vigilant in protecting the most vulnerable members of our society. In the quiet moments before sleep, as we process stories like Carly's, we're reminded of our own mortality and the importance of living each day with purpose and compassion. Her story, tragic as it is, continues to teach us about resilience, community, and the ongoing work of making our world safer for all children. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll spare a thought for Carly Brucia, an 11-year-old girl whose brief life had an enormous impact, whose story changed laws and communities, and whose memory continues to inspire efforts to protect children everywhere. In remembering her story, we honor her life and commit ourselves to the ongoing work of creating a safer world for all children. Please, if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to the channel, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we delve into one of the most disturbing criminal cases in recent American history, the story of Joseph Edward Duncan III, a man whose actions would forever change multiple families and communities across the country. This is a story that spans decades, crosses state lines, and reveals the darkest corners of human behavior. As we explore this case together, we'll uncover how one person's troubled past evolved into a series of heinous crimes that shocked the nation. Joseph Edward Duncan III was born on February 25, 1963, at Fort Bragg Military Base in North Carolina. He was the fourth of 5 children in what appeared to be a typical military family, 3 older sisters, Joseph, and a younger brother. His father served in the U.S. Army, which meant the Duncan family lived a life of constant movement, relocating every year or two as military families often do. They moved not just within the United States, but internationally as well, creating an unstable foundation for a child who would later claim that these early years shaped his worldview in profound and troubling ways. The family eventually settled in Tacoma, Washington, after Joseph's father completed his military service. But by then, the pattern of instability had been set. Joseph would later describe his childhood as filled with confusion, isolation, and an inability to form lasting connections. Whether these moves contributed to his later psychological development, or whether darker forces were already at work within him, remains a subject of debate among criminal psychologists. What we do know is that Joseph's childhood was marked by troubling behavior that began to manifest at an early age. Unlike many children who might act out temporarily due to frequent relocations, Joseph's behavioral issues seemed to intensify rather than resolve as he grew older. He struggled in school, had difficulty maintaining friendships, and began to display signs of the antisocial tendencies that would later define his adult life. As Joseph entered his teenage years, his behavior became increasingly concerning. He began to exhibit signs of what psychologists would later identify as conduct disorder, a pattern of behavior characterized by aggression, deceitfulness, and a persistent disregard for social norms and the rights of others. These weren't typical teenage rebellions or phases that most adolescents experience and eventually outgrow. Instead, they were consistent patterns that suggested something fundamentally wrong with how Joseph processed the world around him. His family noticed these changes but, like many families dealing with troubled teens, they hoped it was something he would eventually grow out of. They sought help through various channels: counseling, discipline, attempts to provide structure and stability. But nothing seemed to reach Joseph or alter the trajectory he was on. His behavior continued to escalate, and by his late teens, it became clear that his issues were far more serious than typical adolescent problems. The first official recognition of Joseph's dangerous tendencies came when he was still a young man. The legal system would soon become very familiar with his name, as his criminal behavior began to manifest in ways that could no longer be ignored or explained away as youthful indiscretion. These early encounters with law enforcement marked the beginning of a pattern that would continue for decades, periods of incarceration followed by release, only to be followed by increasingly serious crimes. Joseph's first significant brush with the law occurred in the early 1980s when he was convicted of sexually assaulting a young boy. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or a momentary lapse in judgment, it was a calculated act that revealed the depths of his deviant mindset. The crime resulted in his first prison sentence, and it established a pattern that would define the rest of his life, targeting vulnerable children, using manipulation and force to achieve his goals, and showing no genuine remorse for his actions. During his initial incarceration, Joseph underwent various psychological evaluations and treatments designed to address his criminal behavior. Prison psychologists noted his intelligence, he was articulate, capable of appearing charming when it suited his purposes, and demonstrated an understanding of right and wrong that made his choices all the more chilling. He wasn't acting out of ignorance or mental incapacity, he was making deliberate decisions to harm others despite fully understanding the consequences of his actions. When Joseph was eventually released on parole in the mid-1990s, he entered a world that was largely unprepared for someone with his particular combination of intelligence, manipulation skills, and complete lack of empathy. The parole system, designed to help former inmates reintegrate into society, became instead a platform for Joseph to refine his methods and expand his criminal activities. The period between 1994 and 1997, when Joseph was on parole, would later be identified by investigators as one of the most dangerous phases of his criminal career. During these years, he managed to maintain the appearance of compliance with his parole requirements while secretly planning and executing some of his most heinous crimes. This ability to lead a double life, appearing reformed to authorities while continuing to commit serious crimes, demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication that made him particularly dangerous. It was during this time that investigators now believe Joseph was responsible for several unsolved cases that had puzzled law enforcement for years. The crimes showed a clear escalation in both frequency and severity, suggesting that his time in prison had not rehabilitated him but had instead allowed him to develop more refined methods for avoiding detection. One of the most tragic cases from this period involved Samiejo White and Carmen Cubayas in Seattle in 1996. These two individuals became victims of Joseph's increasingly violent tendencies, though their connection to him wouldn't be discovered until much later. The crimes demonstrated his ability to strike quickly and disappear, leaving behind little evidence and creating cold cases that would haunt investigators for years. But it was in 1997 that Joseph committed what many consider to be one of his most horrific crimes during this period, the abduction and murder of 10-year-old Anthony Martinez in Beaumont, California. Anthony Martinez was just 10 years old when his life was cut tragically short on April 4, 1997. He was playing in a neighbor's yard in Beaumont, California, with his brother and some friends, engaging in the kind of innocent childhood activity that should have been completely safe. The children were enjoying their time together, unaware that they were being watched by someone with the darkest of intentions. Joseph Duncan had been stalking the area, looking for an opportunity. His methods had become more sophisticated since his earlier crimes, and he had developed a pattern of surveillance that allowed him to identify potential victims and plan his attacks with frightening precision. On this particular day, Anthony and the other children became targets of this predatory behavior. The attack happened quickly. Joseph initially attempted to abduct Anthony's brother, but the boy managed to fight back and escape with Anthony's help. In a moment that would haunt his family forever, Anthony's act of helping his brother save himself ultimately led to his own capture. Joseph, frustrated that his initial target had escaped, grabbed Anthony instead and fled the scene. What followed was every parent's worst nightmare. Anthony was taken to a remote location where Joseph subjected him to unthinkable abuse before ultimately taking his life. The crime was not just murder, it was a calculated act of violence against an innocent child who had done nothing more than help his brother escape from danger. Anthony's disappearance launched a massive search effort involving local police, federal authorities, and hundreds of volunteers from the community. His family held on to hope for as long as possible, but as days turned into weeks without any sign of the boy, the grim reality began to set in. Anthony's body was eventually discovered, and the evidence pointed to a crime of exceptional brutality and depravity. The investigation into Anthony's murder became one of the largest in the region's history. Investigators worked tirelessly to identify the perpetrator, but Joseph had covered his tracks well. The case went cold, joining the growing list of unsolved crimes that would later be attributed to him. For years, Anthony's family lived without answers, knowing that their son's killer was still free and potentially threatening other children. After the Anthony Martinez murder, Joseph managed to avoid detection and continued his criminal activities. He was eventually caught on other charges and returned to prison, but he was released again in 2000. This second release would prove to be even more dangerous than the first, as Joseph's methods had become increasingly sophisticated and his violent tendencies had continued to escalate. By 2005, Joseph had identified a new target, the Gruen family of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The family consisted of Brenda Gruen, a single mother trying to build a new life with her boyfriend Mark Mackenzie, and her children. The family included 13-year-old Slade Gruen, 9-year-old Dylan Gruen, and 8-year-old Shasta Gruen. They were a typical American family, dealing with the everyday challenges of blended family life while trying to create a stable, loving home for the children. What the Gruen family didn't know was that they had attracted the attention of a predator who had been watching them, studying their routines, and planning an attack that would devastate their lives forever. Joseph's surveillance methods had become incredibly sophisticated over the years. He would conduct what he called reconnaissance missions, observing potential targets for weeks or even months before striking. Joseph had developed a particular interest in the Gruen children, and he began planning an elaborate scheme to gain access to them. His plan was methodical and detailed, involving multiple phases and contingencies. He studied the family's daily routines, learned their schedules, and identified the best times and methods for approaching their home without being detected. On the night of May 15, 2005, Joseph Duncan put his plan into action. The Gruen family was settling in for what should have been a quiet evening at home. Brenda and Mark were spending time together while the children prepared for bed, unaware that they were being watched from the darkness outside their home. Joseph had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He had gathered the tools he would need, planned his approach route, and identified his escape path. His plan was not simply to commit a crime of opportunity, it was a calculated assault designed to achieve specific goals with maximum efficiency and minimum risk of detection. In the early hours of May 16, Joseph made his move. Using methods he had perfected over years of criminal activity, he gained entry to the Gruen home while the family slept. His approach was swift and violent, designed to incapacitate the adults before they could respond or call for help. The attack that followed was one of the most brutal home invasions in Idaho's history. Joseph used a combination of weapons, including a framing hammer and a shotgun, to murder Brenda Gruen, Mark Mackenzie, and 13-year-old Slade Gruen. The violence was extreme and unnecessary, far beyond what would have been required to simply incapacitate his victims. This suggested that the murders weren't just means to an end, but were themselves part of Joseph's motivation. While the three oldest family members were killed, 8-year-old Shasta and 9-year-old Dylan Gruen were spared immediate death. Instead, Joseph bound them and placed them outside on the lawn while he completed his grisly work inside the house. The children, traumatized and terrified, could only wait and wonder what would happen to them next. After completing the murders, Joseph returned to collect the two surviving children. His plan had always been to abduct them, and the murders of their family members were simply necessary steps to achieve this goal. He loaded Shasta and Dylan into his vehicle and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a crime scene that would shock investigators and horrify the community. The bodies of Brenda Gruen, Mark Mackenzie, and Slade Gruen were discovered later on May 16, 2005, when family members became concerned about the family's absence and went to check on them. What they found was a scene of unimaginable violence and horror. The three victims had been brutally murdered, and two of the children were missing without a trace. The discovery launched one of the largest manhunts in Idaho's history. Law enforcement agencies from across the region joined forces to search for the missing children and their abductor. The FBI was brought in to coordinate the investigation, and the case quickly became a national priority. Amber Alerts were issued, and the media coverage was extensive, with Anthony and Shasta's photos being broadcast across the country. Investigators worked around the clock to process the crime scene and develop leads. The brutality of the murders and the abduction of the children created a sense of urgency that drove the investigation forward at an unprecedented pace. Every available resource was dedicated to finding the children and bringing their captor to justice. The community response was overwhelming. Volunteers organized search parties, distributed flyers, and coordinated efforts to spread awareness about the missing children. The case touched people across the nation, and the support for the family was immense. Everyone hoped that Shasta and Dylan would be found alive, though as days passed without any sign of them, that hope began to fade. For 7 weeks, Shasta and Dylan Gruen endured experiences that no child should ever have to face. Joseph had taken them to a remote campsite in the Montana wilderness, where he held them captive while subjecting them to ongoing abuse and psychological torture. The location was carefully chosen, isolated enough that their cries for help couldn't be heard, but accessible enough that Joseph could move them if necessary. During this period, Joseph documented his crimes with video and photographic evidence, creating a record of his actions that would later prove crucial in his prosecution. These materials revealed the extent of his depravity and provided investigators with undeniable proof of his guilt. The recordings also showed that his crimes weren't impulsive acts of violence, but were part of a calculated pattern of behavior designed to satisfy his twisted psychological needs. The children endured unthinkable trauma during their captivity. They were completely at the mercy of someone who viewed them not as human beings with rights and dignity, but as objects to be used for his own gratification. The psychological impact of their experiences would affect them for the rest of their lives, requiring years of therapy and support to begin processing what they had endured. Throughout their captivity, the children displayed remarkable resilience and courage. They looked out for each other and found ways to cope with their impossible situation. Their bond as siblings became a source of strength that helped them survive experiences that might have completely broken other children. As the weeks passed, Joseph's behavior became increasingly erratic and dangerous. He began to make plans for what he would do with the children long term, and these plans included scenarios that would have resulted in their deaths. The children's survival was becoming increasingly uncertain with each passing day. On July 2, 2005, Joseph made a decision that would end 9-year-old Dylan Gruen's life. The exact circumstances of Dylan's murder remain largely sealed in court records to protect his surviving sister, but investigators determined that his death was particularly brutal even by Joseph's standards. Dylan had endured 7 weeks of captivity and abuse, showing remarkable strength and courage throughout his ordeal, only to have his young life ended in a moment of senseless violence. Dylan's murder marked a turning point in the case. Joseph had now killed 4 people, 3 members of the Gruen family and Dylan himself. His crimes had escalated to a level that shocked even experienced investigators who thought they had seen the worst that humanity had to offer. The death of this innocent 9-year-old boy represented the ultimate failure of the systems designed to protect society's most vulnerable members. The murder also represented a crucial mistake on Joseph's part. Up until this point, he had managed to avoid detection for weeks while holding the children captive. But Dylan's death created additional evidence and changed the dynamics of his situation with Shasta, ultimately contributing to the circumstances that would lead to his capture. For Shasta, losing her brother while still being held captive represented trauma beyond comprehension. She had already lost her mother, stepfather, and older brother in the initial attack, and now she had to witness the death of her younger brother as well. The psychological impact of these experiences would require extensive therapy and support for years to come. On July 2, 2005, the same day that Dylan was murdered, Joseph made a decision that would ultimately lead to his downfall. For reasons that remain unclear, he decided to take 8-year-old Shasta to a Denny's restaurant in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, not far from where her family had been murdered 7 weeks earlier. This decision represented either incredible arrogance or a breakdown in his usually careful planning. At the restaurant, a sharp-eyed waitress noticed something unusual about the man and young girl sitting in her section. The girl seemed frightened and withdrawn, and something about the situation didn't feel right. The waitress had been following the Gruen case in the news, and she began to suspect that she might be looking at Shasta Gruen and her abductor. The waitress discreetly contacted law enforcement, reporting her suspicions about the pair in the restaurant. Her quick thinking and willingness to trust her instincts would prove to be the break that investigators had been hoping for since the beginning of the case. Within minutes, police officers were on their way to the Denny's, hoping that this lead would finally provide answers about the missing children. When officers arrived at the restaurant, they quickly confirmed what the waitress had suspected. the little girl was indeed Shasta Gruen, and the man with her was her abductor. Joseph was taken into custody without incident, apparently resigned to the fact that his crime spree had finally come to an end. After 7 weeks of searching, one of the most intensive manhunts in Idaho history was over. The arrest made national headlines, and the news that Shasta had been found alive brought relief to communities across the country that had been following the case. However, the joy of finding her alive was tempered by the grim reality that Dylan was nowhere to be found, and investigators feared the worst about his fate. With Joseph Duncan in custody, investigators finally had the opportunity to learn the full scope of his crimes. During questioning, he initially remained silent about many aspects of the case, but physical evidence and his own documentation of his crimes began to tell the story that he was reluctant to share. The discovery of Joseph's campsite in Montana revealed the location where the children had been held captive. Evidence at the site confirmed that both children had been there, and it provided crucial information about what they had endured during their weeks of captivity. Investigators also found Dylan's remains, finally providing closure about his fate and allowing his family to lay him to rest. The investigation into Joseph's background revealed a pattern of criminal behavior spanning decades. His connection to the Anthony Martinez case in California was established through DNA evidence and other forensic techniques that had advanced significantly since 1997. Suddenly, investigators had answers to cold cases that had puzzled them for years. The FBI launched a nationwide review of unsolved cases involving missing children, looking for other crimes that might be connected to Joseph. This review revealed that he was potentially linked to several other disappearances and murders that had occurred during periods when he was free from prison. The scope of his criminal activity was far broader than anyone had initially realized. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Joseph had been living a double life for decades. He had managed to present himself as a reformed individual to parole officers and others in authority while secretly planning and executing some of the most heinous crimes in recent memory. His ability to manipulate the system and avoid detection for so long raised serious questions about how such individuals should be monitored and managed. Joseph Duncan's legal proceedings were complex and lengthy, involving charges in multiple jurisdictions for crimes committed across several states. In Idaho, he faced charges for the murders of Brenda Gruen, Mark McKenzie, Slade Gruen, and Dylan Gruen, as well as kidnapping charges related to Shasta and Dylan's abduction. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. In addition to physical evidence and witness testimony, they had Joseph's own documentation of his crimes, which provided undeniable proof of his guilt. The videos and photographs he had taken during the children's captivity were so disturbing that they were shown only to the jury and select court personnel, with extreme precautions taken to prevent their broader distribution. Joseph's defense team faced an impossible task. The evidence against him was so comprehensive and damning that there was no realistic possibility of claiming innocence. Instead, they focused on trying to spare him the death penalty by arguing for life imprisonment without parole. However, the heinous nature of his crimes, particularly his treatment of the children, made even this limited goal extremely difficult to achieve. During the proceedings, Shasta Gruen, despite her young age and traumatic experiences, provided testimony that was crucial to the prosecution's case. Her courage in facing her abductor in court and providing details about her experiences demonstrated remarkable strength and resilience. Her testimony helped ensure that justice would be served for her family and for Dylan. The case in California for Anthony Martinez's murder proceeded separately, with prosecutors there also seeking the death penalty. The discovery of DNA evidence linking Joseph to Anthony's murder provided closure to that family after years of wondering who had taken their son's life and why. Joseph Duncan was ultimately convicted on all charges in both Idaho and California. The juries in both cases concluded that the evidence was overwhelming and that his crimes warranted the ultimate punishment. The death sentences were seen as appropriate given the particularly heinous nature of his crimes and the complete lack of remorse he showed for his actions. The sentencing phases of the trials provided opportunities for victim impact statements from family members and friends of those who had been killed. These statements painted pictures of the lives that had been lost and the ongoing impact of Joseph's crimes on the surviving family members and the broader community. Brenda Gruen was remembered as a loving mother who was working hard to build a stable life for her children. Mark Mackenzie was described as a man who had embraced his role as a stepfather and was committed to helping create a loving family environment. 13-year-old Slade was remembered for his intelligence, humor, and the bright future that had been cut short. 9-year-old Dylan was remembered for his sweet nature and the joy he brought to everyone who knew him. Anthony Martinez's family also had the opportunity to share their memories of their son and the impact his loss had on their lives. They spoke of a bright, loving boy whose life was ended just as it was beginning, and of the years of uncertainty they had endured not knowing who had taken him or why. The sentences provided a measure of legal closure to the cases, but the families affected by Joseph's crimes would continue to deal with the emotional and psychological impacts for the rest of their lives. The legal system had done its job in holding him accountable, but it could not undo the damage he had caused or restore the lives he had taken. Following his sentencing, Joseph Duncan was housed on death row while his appeals worked their way through the court system. During this time, he occasionally granted interviews to journalists and researchers, providing insights into his motivations and thought processes that were both fascinating and deeply disturbing. In these interviews, Joseph displayed a complex mixture of intelligence, manipulation, and self-pity. He was capable of articulating psychological concepts and discussing his crimes in clinical terms, but he consistently failed to show genuine remorse for his actions. Instead, he often portrayed himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control, refusing to accept full responsibility for the choices he had made. His writings and statements from prison revealed an individual who understood the difference between right and wrong but chose to ignore these distinctions when they conflicted with his desires. He demonstrated the classic characteristics of a psychopath: superficial charm, manipulativeness, and a complete lack of empathy for his victims. The appeals process continued for years, with Joseph's defense team arguing various legal points in an attempt to overturn his death sentences or at least delay their execution. These appeals were routine parts of the legal process, but they provided little hope for success given the overwhelming evidence of his guilt and the nature of his crimes. During his time on death row, Joseph's health began to decline. He developed various medical conditions that are common among long-term inmates, and his physical condition deteriorated significantly from what it had been during his active criminal years. On March 28, 2021, Joseph Edward Duncan III died of natural causes while on death row at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was 58 years old at the time of his death, having spent his final years confined to a small cell while his appeals slowly worked their way through the court system. His death brought a mixture of emotions to the families of his victims. Some felt relief that he could no longer harm anyone else or continue to manipulate the legal system through endless appeals. Others felt cheated that he had died before facing execution for his crimes. All struggled with the reality that his death could not bring back their loved ones or undo the trauma he had caused. For Shasta Gruen, who had survived her ordeal and grown into a young adult, Joseph's death represented the end of a chapter in her life that had begun with unthinkable trauma. She had spent years in therapy working to overcome the psychological impact of her experiences, and his death meant she would never have to worry about him potentially being released or escaping from prison. The case of Joseph Edward Duncan III serves as a stark reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within some individuals and the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members. His crimes spanned decades and affected multiple families across several states, leaving a trail of devastation that will be felt for generations. The Duncan case led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies share information about suspected predators and coordinate investigations across state lines. The delays in connecting him to the Anthony Martinez case and other crimes highlighted the need for better communication and data sharing between jurisdictions. The case also raised important questions about the parole system and how individuals with histories of serious violent crimes should be monitored and supervised. Joseph's ability to commit multiple murders while on parole demonstrated significant failures in the systems designed to protect public safety. The trauma experienced by Shasta Gruen led to increased awareness about the long-term psychological impacts of violent crimes on child survivors. Her case became a focal point for discussions about how to best support young victims of serious crimes and help them recover from their experiences. The community response to the Gruen family murders demonstrated both the best and worst aspects of human nature. While the overwhelming support and volunteer efforts showed community solidarity and compassion, the case also attracted unwanted attention from individuals with unhealthy interests in the details of the crimes. The media coverage of the case raised questions about how to balance public interest in criminal cases with the privacy and dignity of victims and their families. The extensive coverage helped locate Shasta and bring Joseph to justice, but it also created ongoing challenges for the survivors as they attempted to rebuild their lives. Today, more than 15 years after the Gruen family murders, the impact of Joseph Duncan's crimes continues to be felt. Shasta Gruen has worked to build a normal life despite her traumatic experiences, and she has occasionally spoken publicly about the importance of supporting child victims of violent crimes. The families of all of Joseph's victims continue to deal with their losses and the ongoing impact of his crimes on their lives. They have found different ways to honor the memories of their loved ones and to find meaning in their experiences, but the pain of their losses remains with them always. Law enforcement agencies continue to study the Duncan case as an example of how predators can evade detection and continue committing crimes for extended periods. The case has become part of training programs for investigators and has influenced policies about information sharing and case coordination. The case has also become a subject of academic study, with criminologists and psychologists examining Joseph's behavior patterns and the factors that may have contributed to his criminal development. These studies contribute to ongoing efforts to better understand and prevent similar crimes in the future. The story of Joseph Edward Duncan III is one of the darkest chapters in recent American criminal history. His crimes affected multiple families across several states and demonstrated the devastating impact that one individual can have on countless lives. From his troubled childhood through his years of criminal activity to his final days on death row, his story serves as a stark reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within some individuals. The courage shown by his survivors, particularly Shasta Gruen, provides hope that even the most traumatic experiences can be overcome with proper support and determination. Their resilience in the face of unthinkable tragedy demonstrates the strength of the human spirit and the possibility of healing even after the most devastating losses. The investigation and prosecution of Joseph Duncan's crimes showed both the capabilities and limitations of our justice system. While ultimately successful in bringing him to justice, the case also revealed significant gaps in how information is shared between jurisdictions and how dangerous individuals are monitored and supervised. As we reflect on this case, we remember the victims: Brenda Gruen, a loving mother working to build a better life for her children; Mark McKenzie, a man committed to his new family; 13-year-old Slade Gruen, whose bright future was cut short; 9-year-old Dylan Gruen, whose sweet nature touched everyone who knew him; and 10-year-old Anthony Martinez, whose act of courage in trying to help his brother ultimately cost him his own life. We also remember the survivors, particularly Shasta Gruen, whose courage in the face of unimaginable trauma has inspired countless others and whose survival serves as a testament to the possibility of healing and hope even after the darkest experiences. The case of Joseph Edward Duncan III reminds us of the importance of vigilance in protecting our community's most vulnerable members and of the ongoing need to improve our systems for identifying, investigating, and prosecuting those who would harm innocent people. It also reminds us of the preciousness of life and the importance of cherishing our time with loved ones, for we never know when that time might be cut short by forces beyond our control. In closing, this case stands as both a warning about the evil that can exist in our world and a testament to the resilience, courage, and strength that can emerge from even the darkest circumstances. The memories of those who were lost will continue to be honored by those who loved them, and their stories will continue to serve as reminders of both the fragility and the preciousness of human life. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we explore a case that shook the quiet community of Riverton, Utah in 2012, the tragic murder of 15-year-old Annie Kasperzak. This is a story of a young girl who fought through incredible hardships, only to have her life cut short by someone she trusted. So as we settle in, let me tell you about Annie. Annie Grace Kasperzak entered this world on January 10, 1997, but her early years were far from the fairy tale childhood most children deserve. Born into circumstances that would challenge even the strongest adult, Annie faced adversity from her very first breath. By the time she reached 7 years old, she had already experienced more upheaval and instability than many people encounter in a lifetime. The details of Annie's earliest years paint a picture of neglect and abandonment. She moved through Utah's foster care system like a leaf carried by an unpredictable wind, never quite finding a place to call home. Group homes, temporary placements, social workers with overflowing caseloads, this was Annie's reality during those formative years when most children are learning to ride bicycles and losing their first teeth. But Annie was a fighter. Even as a small child, she possessed an inner strength that would serve her well throughout her short life. Those who knew her during this period remember a girl who, despite everything she had endured, still managed to smile. She had a way of lighting up a room, even when her own world seemed perpetually dark. When Annie turned 9, her life took what seemed like a turn for the better. A couple named Veronica and Dennis Kasperzak decided to open their hearts and their home to this resilient little girl. The adoption process was completed, and for the first time in her life, Annie had a real family. She had parents who chose her, who wanted her, who promised to love and protect her. The Kasperzaks lived in a comfortable home, and Annie finally had her own room, her own space to decorate and call her own. She could go to sleep each night knowing she wouldn't wake up somewhere different. For a child who had experienced such instability, this sense of permanence must have felt like a miracle. But life, as Annie had already learned, rarely follows a straight path. As she grew older and settled into her new family, cracks began to appear in what had seemed like her perfect new life. Veronica and Dennis Kasperzak's marriage began to deteriorate. The arguing started quietly at first, hushed conversations behind closed doors, but gradually escalated into something that couldn't be hidden from a perceptive child like Annie. Divorce is difficult for any child to navigate, but for Annie, who had already experienced so much loss and abandonment, watching her adoptive parents' marriage crumble must have felt like yet another betrayal by the adults who were supposed to protect her. The finalization of the divorce meant another major change in Annie's living situation, another adjustment to make. After the divorce, both Veronica and Dennis remarried. Veronica found love again with a man named James Bratcher, and they made their home in Draper, Utah. Dennis also remarried, and Annie found herself splitting time between two households, two families, two different sets of rules and expectations. While both parents continued to love Annie deeply, the constant back and forth added another layer of complexity to an already complicated young life. Despite these challenges, Annie continued to demonstrate remarkable resilience. She adapted to her new living arrangements with grace that belied her young age. Those who knew her during this time remember her as a bright, articulate girl who seemed older than her years in some ways, yet retained an essential vulnerability that made adults want to protect her. As Annie entered her teenage years, she faced the typical challenges that all adolescents encounter: the pressure to fit in, the struggle to find her identity, the turbulent emotions that come with hormonal changes and social pressures. But for Annie, these normal teenage difficulties were compounded by the trauma of her early childhood and the ongoing complexity of her family situation. Annie attended Summit Academy in Draper, Utah, where she was known as a freshman who tried hard to connect with her peers. The school was smaller than traditional public schools, which often meant that students knew each other well and formed tight-knit communities. For Annie, who was still learning how to trust and form lasting relationships, this environment could be both comforting and intimidating. Her teachers remember her as a student who was bright but sometimes struggled with attendance and consistency. This wasn't unusual for a teenager dealing with complex family dynamics and the lingering effects of early childhood trauma. Annie was working through issues that most adults would find challenging, all while trying to maintain decent grades and navigate the social landscape of high school. It was during this time that Annie met Darwin Christopher Bagshaw. Darwin, who went by the nickname Chris, was just 14 years old, a year younger than Annie but mature for his age in ways that seemed to appeal to her. Like many teenage relationships, theirs began with the intensity and passion that only first love can bring. To the outside world, Annie and Chris seemed like a typical young couple. They would text constantly, spend hours on the phone, and find excuses to see each other whenever possible. Annie's friends noticed how happy she seemed when she talked about Chris, how her face would light up when his name appeared on her phone screen. But teenage relationships, especially intense first loves, can be complicated and emotionally volatile. Both Annie and Chris were dealing with their own personal struggles, she with her traumatic past and complex family situation, and he with whatever pressures and influences were shaping his young life. They were both at an age where emotions run high and decision-making skills are still developing. As their relationship progressed through the winter and into the spring of 2012, those close to Annie began to notice changes in her behavior. She seemed more secretive sometimes, more emotional. Her moods would swing from euphoric happiness to deep sadness with little apparent cause. To some extent, this is normal teenage behavior, especially for someone dealing with the kind of background trauma Annie carried. But there were signs that something more specific was troubling her. In early March 2012, Annie confided in some friends that she believed she might be pregnant. For a 15-year-old girl, this possibility would be overwhelming under the best of circumstances. For Annie, who had already experienced so much instability and was still finding her footing with her adoptive families, the prospect of teenage pregnancy must have felt catastrophic. The friends she told remember her seeming both scared and uncertain about what to do next. She hadn't taken a pregnancy test yet, so she wasn't sure if her suspicions were correct, but the possibility was enough to send her into a state of anxiety and fear. She worried about how her adoptive parents would react, whether they would be disappointed in her, whether this would somehow jeopardize her place in the family she had worked so hard to belong to. Most importantly, Annie was concerned about how Chris would react to the news. Their relationship, while intense, was still new in many ways, and they were both so young. She knew that news of a possible pregnancy would change everything between them, but she had no way of predicting exactly how he would respond. Saturday, March 10, 2012, dawned like any other spring day in Utah. The winter snow was beginning to melt, creating small streams and puddles throughout the area. Annie woke up at her home in Riverton, where she was staying with her adoptive father Dennis and his wife. It was a weekend, so there was no school to attend, no immediate obligations to fulfill. Annie spent the morning like many teenagers do on weekends, sleeping late, checking her phone, perhaps watching television or browsing the internet. But as the day progressed, she seemed to grow increasingly restless. Those who saw her that day would later remember that she seemed anxious about something, though she didn't share what was troubling her. By afternoon, Annie had made plans to meet Chris. The exact details of how this meeting was arranged, whether it was planned in advance or decided spontaneously, would later become important to investigators trying to piece together the events of that day. What is known is that Annie left her house in Riverton with the intention of meeting her boyfriend somewhere. The Jordan River runs through the Salt Lake Valley like a lifeline, providing water, recreation, and natural beauty to the communities it passes through. In March, with the spring snow melt beginning, the river runs higher and faster than during the dry summer months. It's a place where people go to walk, to think, to find solace in nature. For teenagers looking for privacy away from parents and siblings, the Jordan River Trail system provides numerous secluded spots where couples can talk without interruption. Annie and Chris met somewhere along the Jordan River that afternoon. Whether they chose this location deliberately or ended up there during the course of their conversation, it would prove to be a fateful decision. The area where they met was relatively isolated, far enough from houses and roads that they could speak privately about whatever urgent matter had brought them together. According to what would later be revealed in court, Annie told Chris about her pregnancy concerns during this meeting. For a 14-year-old boy, news of a possible pregnancy from his girlfriend would be overwhelming. Most adults would struggle to process such information calmly. For a teenager whose brain is still developing and whose emotional regulation skills are limited, the news could be devastating. What happened next would forever change multiple lives and devastate two families. According to the eventual confession, Chris reacted to Annie's news with anger and panic. In his young mind, the possibility of Annie being pregnant represented a catastrophic threat to his future, his family relationships, and his sense of control over his own life. In that moment of panic and rage, Chris picked up a shovel that happened to be near their location along the river. Perhaps it had been left there by maintenance workers, or maybe it belonged to someone who lived nearby. Whatever its origin, it became a weapon in the hands of a frightened, angry teenager who made a split-second decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Chris struck Annie with the shovel multiple times. The force of the blows was devastating. Annie, who had survived so much in her 15 years, neglect, abandonment, the foster care system, family upheaval, could not survive this final betrayal by someone she trusted and loved. After the attack, Chris faced another moment of decision. He could call for help, try to get Annie to a hospital, contact authorities. Instead, panic took over completely, and he chose to hide what he had done. He left Annie's body in or near the Jordan River, hoping perhaps that it would look like an accident, that somehow he could avoid responsibility for what had happened. But violence like this leaves traces that are impossible to completely erase. As Chris walked away from the scene, he had no idea that a massive investigation was about to begin, one that would eventually lead back to him despite his best efforts to cover his tracks. When Annie didn't come home that Saturday evening, her family initially wasn't overly concerned. Teenagers, especially those dividing their time between two households, sometimes lose track of time or forget to check in. Annie was generally responsible, but she was also 15 years old and in love, which meant her priorities weren't always perfectly aligned with her parents' expectations. As the hours passed and Annie still hadn't returned or answered her phone, concern began to grow. Her parents tried calling her cell phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. They contacted friends, asking if anyone had seen her or knew where she might be. The responses were all variations of the same theme: no one had seen Annie since earlier in the day. By late evening, concern had escalated to genuine worry. Annie's parents knew their daughter well enough to understand that disappearing without contact was not typical behavior for her. Despite the challenges she had faced in her young life, Annie was generally considerate of her parents' feelings and understood the importance of staying in touch. Dennis and Veronica, despite their divorce, came together in their shared concern for their adopted daughter. They contacted the Riverton Police Department to report Annie as missing. The responding officers took the initial report, gathering basic information about when Annie was last seen, what she was wearing, and who she might have been with. Missing person cases involving teenagers present unique challenges for law enforcement. Statistics show that the vast majority of teenagers who are reported missing return home within a few days, having stayed with friends or simply lost track of time. However, officers also know that the first 24 hours are crucial in cases where something more serious has occurred. The initial investigation followed standard protocols. Officers contacted Annie's known friends and associates, asking about her recent activities and state of mind. They reached out to both households where Annie spent time, gathering information about her routine and any recent changes in her behavior. They also attempted to ping her cell phone to determine its last known location. Sunday morning, March 11th, arrived with no sign of Annie. Her parents spent a sleepless night waiting for their phones to ring, hoping to hear Annie's voice apologizing for worrying them. Instead, they faced the dawning realization that something serious might have happened to their daughter. The search expanded on Sunday. Police began organizing search teams to check areas where Annie might have gone. They focused initially on locations she was known to frequent: parks, friends' homes, shopping areas popular with teenagers. The Jordan River Trail system was included in these searches, but it's a vast area with numerous access points and hiding spots. It was during one of these searches that the first clue was discovered. Near the Jordan River, searchers found one of Annie's shoes. The discovery sent a chill through everyone involved in the search effort. A missing shoe suggested that something violent had occurred, that Annie hadn't simply wandered away on her own. The location of the shoe helped focus the search efforts on the immediate area along the river. Additional searchers were called in, and the investigation began to shift from a missing person case to a potential homicide investigation. The mood among family members and investigators became more somber as the implications of the discovery sank in. Later that same day, the search teams made the discovery that everyone had been dreading but expecting. Annie's body was found in the Jordan River, not far from where her shoe had been discovered. The discovery confirmed the worst fears of her family and marked the beginning of a homicide investigation that would take years to fully resolve. The discovery of Annie's body transformed what had been a missing person case into a complex homicide investigation. Detective work in murder cases requires a methodical approach, carefully documenting evidence while building a timeline of the victim's last known activities and associations. The initial crime scene processing revealed that Annie had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The severity and nature of her injury suggested that this was not an accidental death or a case of self-harm. Someone had deliberately attacked Annie with enough force to kill her, then disposed of her body in the river. Investigators began the painstaking process of retracing Annie's final day. They interviewed family members, friends, classmates, and anyone else who might have had contact with her. They pulled her phone records to see who she had been in communication with and when. They canvassed the area around the Jordan River, looking for witnesses who might have seen Annie or noticed anything unusual on March 10. One of the most important aspects of any homicide investigation is establishing the victim's relationships and recent interactions. Annie's family and friends were cooperative but also devastated by the loss. During these interviews, investigators learned about Annie's relationship with Chris Bagshaw and about her recent concerns regarding a possible pregnancy. Chris himself was interviewed as part of the investigation, as would be expected given his relationship with Annie. Initial interviews with teenagers require special care, especially when the subject might be involved in the crime. Investigators must balance the need to gather information with legal protections for minors and the recognition that teenagers often respond differently to pressure than adults do. During early interviews, Chris maintained that he hadn't seen Annie on the day she disappeared. He expressed shock and sadness about her death and claimed to have no knowledge of what might have happened to her. His demeanor during these interviews would later be analyzed and reanalyzed by investigators trying to determine if he was telling the truth. The investigation also revealed information that would prove crucial later. The autopsy showed that despite Annie's belief that she might be pregnant, she actually was not. This meant that if pregnancy fears had motivated the crime, the killing had been based on a false premise. A young girl had died because of a pregnancy scare that turned out to be unfounded. As the investigation continued through the spring and into the summer of 2012, detectives pursued numerous leads and theories. They looked at other potential suspects, examined Annie's online activities, and interviewed dozens of people who had known her. Like many complex investigations, this one involved following multiple threads simultaneously, some of which led nowhere while others gradually built toward a clearer picture of what had happened. The case was complicated by the fact that the primary suspect was a juvenile. When dealing with crimes allegedly committed by minors, investigators must follow different protocols and work within a different legal framework than they would with adult suspects. This can sometimes slow the investigative process, but it's necessary to protect the rights of young people who may be involved. For more than 2 years, the investigation into Annie's murder continued at varying levels of intensity. Cold case detectives periodically reviewed the evidence, looking for new angles or connections that might have been missed during the initial investigation. Advanced forensic techniques were applied to evidence from the scene, hoping that technological improvements might reveal new clues. During this period, Chris Bagshaw was not forgotten by investigators, but he was also not their only focus. The case file grew thick with interviews, forensic reports, and investigative notes. Annie's family lived with the daily ache of not knowing who had killed their daughter and whether that person would ever face justice. In October 2014, nearly 2.5 years after Annie's murder, investigators finally had enough evidence to make an arrest. Chris Bagshaw, now 16 years old, was arrested in Grand Junction, Colorado. The specific details of what led to the arrest, whether it was new evidence, a confession, or a combination of factors, would become part of the court record as the case proceeded through the legal system. The arrest brought a mixture of relief and renewed pain to Annie's family. On one hand, they were grateful that someone was finally being held accountable for their daughter's death. On the other hand, the arrest meant reliving the trauma of losing Annie as the case moved through the courts. Chris was extradited back to Utah to face charges. Initially, because he had been 14 at the time of the crime, the case was filed in juvenile court. However, prosecutors argued that the seriousness of the charges warranted trying him as an adult. In April 2015, a juvenile court judge agreed, and the case was transferred to adult court. This decision meant that Chris would face the full weight of adult criminal penalties if convicted. It also meant that his name and details about the case could be made public, whereas juvenile proceedings are typically confidential. The transfer to adult court reflected both the severity of the crime and the legal system's recognition that some acts are so serious that they transcend the age of the perpetrator. The legal proceedings in Chris Bagshaw's case unfolded slowly, as is typical in serious felony cases. Both the prosecution and defense needed time to prepare their cases, review evidence, and interview witnesses. For Annie's family, this waiting period was agonizing. They wanted justice for their daughter, but they also knew that rushing the legal process could potentially jeopardize the outcome. Chris was charged with first-degree murder, a charge that carries significant penalties including the possibility of life in prison. The prosecution's case was built around the evidence gathered during the investigation, including forensic evidence from the crime scene, witness statements, and Chris's own statements to investigators. The defense team faced the challenging task of representing a young client accused of a horrific crime. They had to consider multiple strategies, challenging the evidence, arguing for reduced charges based on Chris's age at the time of the crime, or potentially negotiating a plea agreement that would result in a lesser sentence than what might be imposed after a trial. As the case moved through various pre-trial hearings and motions, both sides prepared for what everyone expected would be a lengthy and emotionally difficult trial. The prosecution had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Chris had deliberately killed Annie. The defense had to either refute this evidence or present mitigating factors that might result in a lesser conviction or sentence. The case was scheduled to go to trial in March 2016, nearly 4 years after Annie's death. For her family, the approaching trial represented both hope for justice and dread at having to relive the worst period of their lives in a public courtroom. For Chris's family, it meant watching their own child face the possibility of spending most of his life in prison for a decision made when he was barely 14 years old. In a dramatic turn of events just days before the scheduled trial, Chris Bagshaw made the decision to plead guilty to first-degree murder. This decision came as a surprise to many observers who had expected the case to go to trial. On March 1, 2016, Chris appeared in court and formally admitted his guilt in Annie's death. The decision to plead guilty was Chris's alone, made with the advice of his attorneys but ultimately reflecting his own choice to take responsibility for his actions. Pleading guilty meant avoiding the uncertainty of a trial but also accepting the serious penalties that come with a first-degree murder conviction. During the plea hearing, details about the crime were presented to the court. According to the prosecution's account, which Chris accepted as accurate. He had indeed killed Annie with a shovel during their meeting by the Jordan River. The attack had been brutal and fatal, and Chris had then left her body at the scene. The court also heard about the motive for the crime. As had been suspected during the investigation, Chris had reacted violently to Annie's statement that she might be pregnant. The irony that she actually was not pregnant added another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking case. Annie's family was present in the courtroom when Chris entered his guilty plea. For them, hearing the official admission of guilt provided some measure of closure, though it could never bring back their daughter or erase the pain of their loss. They had waited nearly 4 years for this moment of accountability. The guilty plea meant that the case would proceed directly to sentencing without a trial. This spared Annie's family the trauma of sitting through weeks of testimony about her death, but it also meant that many details about the investigation and the crime itself would remain private rather than being presented in a public trial. On April 25, 2016, Chris Bagshaw appeared in court for his sentencing hearing. Now 18 years old, he faced the consequences of a decision he had made when he was 14. The hearing provided an opportunity for Annie's family to address the court about the impact of their daughter's death, and for Chris to make a statement about his actions. Annie's family members spoke about the vibrant, resilient young woman they had lost. They described her strength in overcoming a difficult childhood, her efforts to build meaningful relationships despite early trauma, and the bright future that had been stolen from her. They spoke about the ongoing pain of her absence and the ways her death had affected everyone who loved her. Chris also addressed the court, expressing remorse for his actions and acknowledging the pain he had caused to Annie's family and to his own. The sincerity and depth of his remorse would be something for the judge to evaluate in determining his sentence, though it could never undo the irreversible harm he had caused. The judge sentenced Chris Bagshaw to serve 15 years to life in prison. This sentence reflected both the seriousness of his crime and his age at the time he committed it. The possibility of parole after 15 years meant that Chris might eventually have a chance at freedom, but only after serving a significant portion of his life behind bars. For Annie's family, the sentence represented a form of justice, though nothing could truly compensate for their loss. They had seen the person responsible for their daughter's death held accountable, but they still faced a lifetime of missing Annie and wondering about the woman she might have become. The case also raised broader questions about youth violence, the development of decision-making abilities in teenagers, and the appropriate response when children commit serious crimes. Chris had been 14 when he killed Annie, old enough to understand right from wrong, but still a child in many ways. The legal system had grappled with how to balance accountability with recognition of his youth. Today, years after her death, Annie Kasperzak is remembered as more than just a victim of crime. Those who knew her recall her resilience, her ability to find joy despite difficult circumstances, and her determination to build meaningful relationships and create a better life for herself. Annie's story serves as a reminder of the vulnerability of young people, particularly those who have experienced early trauma and instability. It also highlights the devastating consequences that can result from a moment of rage and poor decision-making, especially when combined with the emotional intensity and underdeveloped impulse control that characterize adolescence. The case has been featured in various true crime programs and documentaries, ensuring that Annie's story continues to be told and that the lessons it contains are not forgotten. Her death stands as a tragic example of how quickly a young life can be lost and how violence can destroy not just the primary victim, but entire families and communities. For Annie's adoptive parents and extended family, the process of grieving and healing continues. They have had to find ways to honor Annie's memory while also learning to live with the reality of her absence. The strength they have shown throughout the investigation, trial, and aftermath serves as a testament to their love for Annie and their commitment to seeing that her death was not meaningless. Chris Bagshaw remains incarcerated, serving his sentence and presumably reflecting on the choices that led him to that moment by the Jordan River in March 2012. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the irreversible consequences of violence and the importance of finding healthy ways to deal with overwhelming emotions and situations. The Jordan River continues to flow through the Salt Lake Valley, providing beauty and recreation for countless visitors. But for those who knew Annie, it will always be marked by the memory of what happened there on that March day. In some ways, that's fitting. The river serves as both a memorial to a young life lost and a reminder of the preciousness of life itself. Annie Kasperzak lived for 15 years, facing challenges that would have defeated many adults but continuing to fight for happiness and connection until the very end. Her story reminds us to cherish the young people in our lives, to provide them with the support and guidance they need to navigate difficult times, and to never take for granted the gift of another day together. In the end, Annie's legacy is not defined solely by how she died, but by how she lived, with courage, resilience, and an enduring hope for something better. Those qualities live on in the memories of those who loved her and in the lessons her story continues to teach about the fragility of life and the importance of protecting the vulnerable among us. The case of Annie Kasperzak remains a sobering reminder that violence can erupt suddenly and destroy lives in ways that can never be undone. But it also serves as a testament to the strength of families in the face of unimaginable loss and to the persistence of investigators who refuse to let crimes go unsolved. As we close this story, we remember Annie not as a statistic or a case number, but as a young woman who deserved to live, to love, to make mistakes and learn from them, to grow into adulthood and discover what life had to offer her. Her death was a tragedy that rippled through multiple lives, but her memory continues to touch those who learn her story and are reminded of the preciousness of every young life. Please, I'm just putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, we'll be exploring a deeply tragic case that unfolded on what should have been one of the most peaceful nights of the year. This is the story of Sharon Adelot, a beloved teacher whose life was cut short on Christmas Eve 2013, in the quiet coastal town of Gulf Breeze, Florida. As always, this story is told with respect for the victims and their families. So as we settle in, let me take you through this complex and heartbreaking tale. Gulf Breeze, Florida, sits like a jewel along the Emerald Coast, where the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico meet pristine white sand beaches. It's a place where neighbors know each other's names, where children ride their bikes through tree-lined streets, and where the pace of life moves just a little slower than the rest of the world. In 2013, it was home to about 6,000 residents who enjoyed the kind of small-town life that many people dream of but few get to experience. Among these residents was Sharon Adelot, a 48-year-old woman who had made this peaceful community her home. Sharon wasn't just another face in the crowd, she was woven into the very fabric of Gulf Breeze through her work as a teacher at Holly Navarre Middle School. Day after day, she shaped young minds, offering patience to struggling students and encouragement to those who needed it most. Those who knew Sharon described her as someone special, the kind of person who made others better simply by being in their presence. Her sister, Pamela Hill, would later say that Sharon was one of the best people she had ever known, someone who had the remarkable ability to bring out the best in everyone around her. Sharon's colleagues at the school saw her dedication firsthand, watching as she stayed late to help students who needed extra attention, always with a smile and an encouraging word. But Sharon's most important role wasn't as a teacher, it was as a mother. She had a son named William Brandon Adelot, though he went by Brandon. At 17 years old in 2013, Brandon was a senior at Gulf Breeze High School, where he had carved out quite a reputation for himself. He was a star athlete, particularly skilled on the baseball diamond as a pitcher. His athletic prowess was matched by his academic achievement. Brandon was an honor roll student, the kind of young man that parents and teachers pointed to as an example of success. From the outside, Brandon appeared to have it all. He was popular among his peers, respected by his teachers, and loved by his mother. The future seemed bright for this talented teenager who seemed destined for great things. His athletic abilities had already caught the attention of college scouts, and his academic performance suggested he could succeed in whatever path he chose. But appearances, as we so often discover in these stories, can be deceiving. Behind the facade of success and normalcy, something was beginning to change in Brandon Adelot. Something dark was taking root in the mind of this seemingly perfect teenager, something that would ultimately shatter not just his own life, but the life of the woman who loved him most. The autumn of 2013 brought with it subtle changes in the Adelot household. Those closest to Sharon began to notice that something wasn't quite right between mother and son. The easy relationship they had shared for 17 years seemed to be developing cracks, small fissures that would gradually widen into something more troubling. According to those who knew the family, arguments between Sharon and Brandon had become more frequent since September. These weren't the typical disagreements between a parent and teenager, the usual battles over curfew, grades, or household chores that mark the passage from adolescence to adulthood. These arguments carried a different weight, a tension that seemed to surprise even those who witnessed them. Brandon's father, Randy Adelot, was part of his son's life, though Sharon and Randy were no longer together. Like many divorced parents, they had worked out an arrangement that allowed Brandon to spend time with both of them. Randy would later describe a family dynamic that seemed normal on the surface, but perhaps wasn't as stable as it appeared. The specific nature of the arguments between Sharon and Brandon in those final months remains somewhat unclear. Family disputes often center on issues that seem minor to outsiders but feel monumental to those involved. Perhaps Sharon was concerned about Brandon's future, pressing him about college applications or career plans. Maybe she had noticed changes in his behavior that worried her, the kind of subtle shifts that only a mother would detect. Or perhaps the arguments were about something else entirely: money, relationships, independence, or any of the countless issues that can drive wedges between parents and their teenage children. What we do know is that these disagreements were becoming a pattern, creating an atmosphere of tension in what had once been a peaceful home. Those who knew Brandon during this period might have noticed changes, though they were perhaps too subtle to cause alarm. Teachers might have observed that the formerly focused student seemed distracted. Teammates might have noticed that their star pitcher was more irritable than usual. Friends might have seen flashes of anger that seemed out of character. But these signs, if they existed, weren't dramatic enough to suggest the tragedy that was approaching. Brandon continued to attend school, continued to play baseball, continued to maintain the appearance of a normal teenager navigating the challenges of his senior year. The warning signs, if they were there at all, were whispers rather than shouts. As December arrived, Gulf Breeze began to transform into its holiday splendor. Christmas lights twinkled along the waterfront, shop windows displayed festive decorations, and the community prepared for the kind of peaceful, family-centered celebration that had become tradition in this close-knit town. Sharon Adelot, like millions of other parents across the country, was likely thinking about Christmas gifts, family gatherings, and the joy of watching her son experience what might be his last Christmas at home before heading off to college. She could never have imagined that this season of peace and celebration would become the backdrop for unthinkable tragedy. The date was December 24, 2013. Christmas Eve. A night when families across the world gather to celebrate love, togetherness, and hope for the future. For Sharon Adelot, it would be her last night on Earth. December 24 dawned clear and mild in Gulf Breeze, the kind of perfect Florida winter day that makes the rest of the country envious. The temperature hovered in the comfortable 70s, warm enough for short sleeves but cool enough to remind residents that it was indeed winter, even in paradise. Sharon Adelot went about her Christmas Eve much like countless other parents across the country. There were likely last-minute preparations to make, gifts to wrap, and the anticipation of Christmas morning to savor. As a teacher, she had the luxury of being off work during the holiday break, giving her time to focus on what mattered most: family. According to the arrangements that had been worked out between Sharon and her ex-husband Randy, Brandon was supposed to spend part of Christmas Eve with his father. This kind of holiday custody sharing is common among divorced couples, a way to ensure that children can maintain relationships with both parents during important times of the year. Randy Adelot would later tell investigators that he and Brandon had spent the day Christmas shopping together. It's a detail that adds a poignant layer to the tragedy, a father and son sharing what should have been a joyful experience, picking out gifts and enjoying each other's company during the holiday season. But Randy was running late returning Brandon to his mother's house. Shopping had taken longer than expected, or perhaps they had decided to grab dinner together. Whatever the reason, the schedule that had been arranged was delayed. This delay would prove to be fateful, though not in the way anyone might have expected. As evening approached, Sharon was likely preparing for her son's return. Perhaps she had prepared his favorite meal, or maybe she was waiting to share a Christmas Eve tradition they had maintained throughout his childhood. The house on this quiet Gulf Breeze street was probably warm and inviting, decorated for the holidays and filled with the kind of comfortable anticipation that marks Christmas Eve in homes across America. When Randy finally brought Brandon home, it was later than planned, but not alarmingly so. Christmas Eve schedules often run off track as families juggle multiple commitments and try to squeeze in just one more activity. Randy dropped his son off and departed, likely with wishes for a Merry Christmas and perhaps plans to see Brandon again the next day. What happened next would shatter not just the Adelot family, but an entire community. Brandon entered his mother's house, but he didn't come empty-handed. Hidden in his sleeve was a kitchen knife, a weapon he had brought with clear intent. According to what investigators would later piece together, Brandon was also armed with a baseball bat, perhaps one of the same bats he had used to achieve success on the pitcher's mound, now repurposed for an unthinkable act. There are some details of what followed that are too disturbing to dwell upon, especially in a story meant to help you drift off to sleep. What we know is that Sharon Adelot was attacked in the doorway of her home, the same doorway through which she had welcomed her son countless times throughout his life. The attack was brutal and swift. Later examination would reveal that Sharon had suffered multiple stab wounds and had been beaten with the baseball bat. The violence was overwhelming, what investigators would later describe as overkill, far more than what would have been necessary to cause death. Perhaps most chilling of all, Brandon himself would later tell investigators that there had been no argument that evening, no final confrontation that might have triggered the violence. He simply attacked his mother without provocation, without warning, and without mercy. When the attack was over, Sharon Adelot lay dead in the doorway of her home, and Brandon Adelot's life as he had known it was over as well. The discovery of Sharon's body would come later, when concerned family members or friends realized that something was wrong. The details of who found her and when are less important than the devastating reality of what they discovered: a beloved teacher, devoted mother, and cherished member of the community, killed in her own home by the person who should have loved her most. In the hours following Sharon Adelot's murder, law enforcement officers in Gulf Breeze found themselves investigating a crime that seemed to make no sense. Here was a respected teacher, beloved in her community, killed in her own home on Christmas Eve. The brutality of the attack suggested a level of rage and violence that seemed impossible to reconcile with the quiet neighborhood where it had occurred. But the investigation would not be a lengthy one. Within a short time, officers had located Brandon Adelot and brought him in for questioning. What happened next would be almost as shocking as the crime itself. Rather than deny involvement, rather than claim innocence or point fingers at mysterious intruders, Brandon Adelot confessed. Not only did he confess, but according to police reports, he did so with a demeanor that left investigators deeply unsettled. They described him as smiling during his confession, showing no apparent remorse or emotion as he described how he had killed his mother. This reaction, or lack thereof, would become a crucial element in understanding what had happened on that Christmas Eve. Here was a young man who had just committed matricide, one of the most taboo acts in human society, and he seemed almost pleased about it. Brandon's confession was detailed and matter-of-fact. He described how he had concealed the knife in his sleeve, how he had brought the baseball bat to his mother's home, and how he had carried out the attack. Most disturbing of all, he confirmed what investigators had already suspected, that there had been no argument, no final confrontation that had triggered the violence. He simply decided to kill his mother, and then he did it. This lack of apparent motive made the case even more baffling. While domestic violence and family murders are tragically common, they usually involve some precipitating event, a fight about money, a confrontation about behavior, a history of escalating abuse. But Brandon offered no such explanation. He had simply decided that his mother needed to die. As news of Brandon's arrest spread through Gulf Breeze, the community struggled to make sense of what had happened. Here was a young man they thought they knew, a star athlete, an honor student, a polite teenager who seemed to have everything going for him. How could such a person commit such an act? The local media began referring to Brandon as the "mommy killer," a nickname that captured both the nature of his crime and the public's horror at what he had done. The case became a sensation, not just locally but throughout Florida and beyond, as people tried to understand how a seemingly normal teenager could murder his own mother. Brandon's arrest also marked the beginning of a legal journey that would prove to be almost as complex as the crime itself. Because he was 17 years old at the time of the murder, questions immediately arose about how he should be prosecuted. Would he be tried as an adult? What kind of sentence might he face? And perhaps most importantly, was he mentally competent to stand trial? These questions would take years to answer, during which time Brandon would undergo extensive psychological evaluation. The smiling confession, the lack of apparent motive, and the brutal nature of the crime all suggested that something was deeply wrong with Brandon's mental state. But first, there was a community to heal and a victim to mourn. The news of Sharon Adelot's murder spread through Gulf Breeze like a shockwave, leaving residents struggling to comprehend how such a tragedy could occur in their peaceful community. This wasn't the kind of place where people locked their doors at night or worried about random violence. It was a place where teachers were beloved community figures and teenagers were known for their achievements, not their crimes. At Holly Navarre Middle School, Sharon's colleagues and students grappled with the loss of someone who had touched so many lives. Grief counselors were brought in to help both staff and students process the tragedy. Many of Sharon's fellow teachers spoke about her dedication, her kindness, and her ability to connect with even the most challenging students. The timing of the murder made it even more devastating. Christmas Eve was supposed to be a night of joy and anticipation, not tragedy and loss. Families throughout Gulf Breeze found themselves struggling to explain to their own children how such a thing could happen, especially during a season traditionally associated with love and peace. Sharon's sister, Pamela Hill, became a voice for the family during this difficult time. In interviews with local media, she spoke about Sharon not just as a victim, but as a person who had made the world better simply by being in it. Pamela described Sharon as someone who made others better people, someone whose kindness and compassion had rippled out to touch countless lives. The loss was felt particularly keenly among Sharon's students, both current and former. Middle school can be a difficult time for young people, filled with uncertainty and self-doubt. For many of these students, Sharon had been more than just a teacher, she had been a source of stability, encouragement, and belief in their potential. Now she was gone, killed by her own son in an act that seemed to defy all understanding. As the community grieved, questions began to emerge about warning signs and whether the tragedy could have been prevented. Had anyone noticed changes in Brandon's behavior? Were there red flags that had been missed? Could intervention have saved Sharon's life? These questions would persist for years, but they reflected the natural human need to find meaning and prevention in the face of seemingly senseless violence. The truth is that predicting when someone will commit such an act is extraordinarily difficult, even for mental health professionals with extensive training and resources. Meanwhile, Brandon himself was being held in custody as the legal system began to grapple with his case. The smiling confession had been deeply disturbing to investigators and prosecutors, but it also raised important questions about his mental state. Was this the behavior of someone who was legally sane? Did Brandon understand the nature and consequences of his actions? These questions would become central to the legal proceedings that followed, but first, there was the immediate challenge of understanding what had driven a seemingly normal teenager to commit such an unthinkable act. As investigators and mental health professionals began to delve deeper into Brandon Adelot's case, they encountered a puzzle that defied easy explanation. Here was a young man who, by all outward appearances, had been living a successful and normal life right up until the moment he murdered his mother. Brandon's academic record was exemplary. He was an honor roll student who had never shown signs of serious behavioral problems at school. His athletic achievements were impressive, demonstrating not just physical skill but the discipline and teamwork that successful sports require. His teachers and coaches described him as polite and respectful, the kind of student they were proud to have in their programs. But the brutal nature of the crime and Brandon's reaction to it suggested that something had been terribly wrong beneath the surface. The lack of apparent motive, combined with his disturbing demeanor during confession, pointed to serious mental health issues that had somehow gone undetected. Mental health professionals who evaluated Brandon would eventually identify signs of serious psychological disturbance. Reports suggested that Brandon may have been experiencing auditory hallucinations, voices in his head that told him to commit the murder. This detail, while horrifying, began to provide some framework for understanding how such a seemingly normal teenager could commit such an act. Schizophrenia and other serious mental illnesses often emerge during the late teenage years, precisely the age Brandon was when he killed his mother. These conditions can develop gradually, with subtle changes in thinking and behavior that might not be immediately obvious to family members, teachers, or friends. The voices that Brandon reported hearing represent one of the most disturbing symptoms of severe mental illness. For those who experience them, these auditory hallucinations can be as real and compelling as actual human speech. When the voices command violence, the results can be catastrophic, as they were on that Christmas Eve in 2013. This potential explanation for Brandon's actions raised complex questions about responsibility and justice. If Brandon was indeed suffering from a severe mental illness that compromised his ability to distinguish right from wrong, how should the legal system respond? Was he a cold-blooded killer who deserved to be punished to the full extent of the law, or was he a victim of his own diseased mind who needed treatment rather than punishment? These questions would take years to resolve, during which time Brandon underwent extensive psychiatric evaluation. The legal system moved slowly, carefully weighing the evidence and expert testimony that would determine whether Brandon was competent to stand trial and, if so, whether he could be held legally responsible for his actions. Meanwhile, Sharon's family and friends continued to struggle with their loss. The possibility that Brandon had been suffering from mental illness didn't diminish their grief or make Sharon any less dead. If anything, it added another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking situation, the knowledge that the person who had killed their beloved Sharon might have been as much a victim of circumstances as she was. The case also highlighted broader questions about mental health awareness and intervention, particularly for teenagers. How many other young people might be struggling with similar issues without anyone realizing it? What warning signs should parents, teachers, and friends be watching for? And how can communities better support families dealing with mental health crises? These systemic questions would persist long after Brandon's case was resolved, but first, the legal system had to determine how to respond to what he had done. The legal proceedings in Brandon Adelot's case would stretch out over several years, reflecting the complexity of prosecuting someone whose mental state was central to questions of both competency and responsibility. From the moment of his arrest, it was clear that this would not be a straightforward murder trial. Initially, Brandon was charged with first-degree murder, a charge that in Florida can carry the death penalty or life in prison without parole. However, his age at the time of the crime, just 17 years old, and questions about his mental state immediately complicated the prosecution's path forward. The first major hurdle was determining whether Brandon was competent to stand trial. Legal competency requires that a defendant understand the charges against them, understand the potential consequences, and be able to assist in their own defense. Given Brandon's apparent mental health issues and his disturbing behavior following the murder, this was far from certain. Brandon was initially declared incompetent to stand trial and was committed to a state mental health facility for treatment. This decision reflected the legal system's recognition that prosecuting someone who doesn't understand what's happening to them would violate fundamental principles of justice. For months, mental health professionals worked with Brandon, providing medication and therapy designed to restore his competency. During this time, he remained in state custody, but as a patient rather than an inmate. The goal was to stabilize his mental condition enough that he could participate meaningfully in his own defense. This process was painstaking and uncertain. Some individuals never regain competency, leaving them in a legal limbo where they cannot be prosecuted but also cannot be released. Others respond to treatment and are eventually able to stand trial, though questions about their mental state at the time of the crime remain. Eventually, Brandon was determined to be competent to stand trial, meaning that legal proceedings could move forward. However, competency to stand trial is different from the question of legal insanity at the time of the crime. A defendant can understand their current situation while having been legally insane when they committed their alleged crime. This distinction would prove crucial in Brandon's case. While he had regained enough mental stability to participate in his trial, the question remained whether he had been legally responsible for his actions on that Christmas Eve in 2013. The legal standard for insanity varies by jurisdiction, but generally requires proving that the defendant, due to mental illness, either didn't understand the nature of their actions or didn't know that their actions were wrong. In Brandon's case, the evidence suggested that while he knew he was killing his mother, he may not have been capable of understanding that this was wrong due to his mental illness. Expert witnesses testified about Brandon's mental state, describing the hallucinations and psychological disturbance that had led to the murder. The prosecution, meanwhile, had to balance the seriousness of the crime against the evidence of mental illness, seeking justice for Sharon while acknowledging the complex circumstances surrounding her death. Family members found themselves in the difficult position of seeking justice for Sharon while also recognizing that Brandon had been suffering from severe mental illness. Some family members supported a finding of not guilty by reason of insanity, believing that treatment rather than punishment was the appropriate response. Others felt that Brandon should be held fully accountable for his actions, regardless of his mental state. These divisions within families are common in cases involving mental illness and violence, reflecting the difficulty of balancing compassion, justice, and public safety. There are no easy answers when mental illness intersects with serious crime, and different people can reasonably come to different conclusions about the best path forward. After years of legal proceedings, psychological evaluations, and careful deliberation, the court reached its decision. In October 2016, nearly 3 years after Sharon Adelot's murder, a judge made a decision that would determine Brandon Adelot's fate. After considering extensive expert testimony about Brandon's mental state and the circumstances surrounding the crime, the court found him not guilty by reason of insanity. This verdict reflected the court's conclusion that while Brandon had indeed killed his mother, he was not legally responsible for his actions due to his severe mental illness. The evidence had convinced the judge that Brandon's psychological condition at the time of the murder had compromised his ability to understand right from wrong. For some observers, this verdict represented justice tempered by compassion, recognition that severe mental illness can rob someone of their moral culpability while still acknowledging the tragic reality of Sharon's death. For others, it was a failure of the justice system to hold someone accountable for a brutal murder, regardless of their mental state. The not guilty by reason of insanity verdict meant that Brandon would not go to prison. Instead, he was committed to the Florida State Hospital, where he would remain until mental health professionals determined that he was no longer a danger to himself or others. This could mean months, years, or potentially the rest of his life, depending on his response to treatment and ongoing psychiatric evaluation. This outcome highlighted one of the most challenging aspects of mental health and criminal justice, the tension between punishment and treatment, between protecting society and helping those who are genuinely ill. The insanity defense is rarely used and even more rarely successful, reflecting both its high legal standard and public skepticism about mental illness as an excuse for criminal behavior. In Brandon's case, however, the evidence of serious mental illness was compelling. The auditory hallucinations, the lack of apparent motive, and his disturbing behavior following the murder all pointed to someone whose grasp on reality had been severely compromised. Sharon's sister, Pamela Hill, had supported the insanity finding, believing that Brandon needed treatment rather than punishment. This compassionate response, coming from someone who had lost a beloved family member, reflected her understanding that Brandon himself was, in a sense, a victim of his mental illness. Over the years that followed, Brandon remained at the Florida State Hospital, receiving medication and therapy designed to address his mental health issues. Regular evaluations assessed his progress and his potential risk to public safety. The goal of this treatment was not just to manage his symptoms, but to help him understand the magnitude of what he had done and to develop strategies for preventing future violence. Mental health treatment in these circumstances is complex and long-term. It involves not just medication to address symptoms like hallucinations, but also therapy to help patients understand their illness, develop coping strategies, and process the consequences of their actions. For someone who has committed a violent crime while psychotic, this process can take many years. During his time at the state hospital, Brandon was not free, he was confined to a secure facility and subject to constant supervision. But he was receiving treatment rather than serving time in prison, reflecting the court's determination that he was ill rather than evil. This distinction, between illness and evil, is one that society continues to grapple with, particularly in cases involving violence and mental health. The case of Brandon Adelot illustrates both the tragedy that can result when severe mental illness goes unrecognized and untreated, and the challenge of responding appropriately when mental illness and violence intersect. By 2023, a full decade after Sharon Adelot's murder, Brandon had spent 7 years receiving treatment at the Florida State Hospital. Now 27 years old, he was no longer the confused and ill teenager who had committed matricide on Christmas Eve 2013. The question facing the mental health system and the courts was whether he had recovered sufficiently to be safely moved to a less restrictive environment. Mental health professionals who had been treating Brandon reported significant improvement in his condition. The medication and therapy he had received had apparently been effective in managing his symptoms and helping him understand his illness. He had shown remorse for his actions and demonstrated understanding of the impact of his crime. This progress led to discussions about the possibility of moving Brandon to a step-down facility, a less restrictive environment that would still provide supervision and treatment while allowing him more freedom than the state hospital provided. Such facilities serve as transitional environments for patients who have made progress but are not yet ready for complete independence. The prospect of Brandon's potential release from the state hospital was controversial within the family and community. While some family members supported the idea that he had been successfully treated and deserved a chance at rehabilitation, others remained concerned about public safety and felt that the severity of his crime warranted continued confinement. These debates reflected broader questions about mental health treatment, rehabilitation, and public safety. How do we determine when someone who has committed a violent crime while mentally ill has recovered sufficiently to safely rejoin society? What level of risk is acceptable, and who should make these determinations? In August 2024, after extensive evaluation and legal proceedings, a judge approved Brandon's transfer to a secure step-down facility. This decision reflected the court's acceptance of expert testimony that Brandon had made significant progress in his treatment and that he could be safely managed in a less restrictive environment. The decision was not taken lightly. It involved careful consideration of Brandon's mental health progress, his understanding of his illness and its management, and the risk he might pose to public safety. Mental health professionals, legal experts, and family members all provided input into this complex decision. For Sharon's family, this development represented another chapter in their long journey of grief and healing. Some family members supported Brandon's move to a less restrictive facility, believing that he had genuinely recovered and deserved the chance to rebuild his life. Others remained concerned about the implications of his potential eventual release. The case continued to raise important questions about mental health treatment, criminal justice, and public safety. How do we balance compassion for those suffering from mental illness with the need to protect society from violence? How do we support families who have been devastated by mental health-related violence while also providing appropriate treatment for those who are ill? These questions don't have easy answers, but Brandon's case illustrates both the tragedy that can result from untreated mental illness and the possibility of recovery and rehabilitation with appropriate treatment. The story of Sharon Adelot and her son Brandon represents one of the most difficult intersections in our society, the place where mental illness meets violence, where family love encounters unthinkable tragedy, and where our systems of justice and healthcare must find ways to respond to circumstances that seem to defy understanding. Sharon's death was a devastating loss not just for her family, but for an entire community. She was a teacher who had dedicated her life to nurturing young minds, a woman who made others better simply by being part of their lives. Her murder on Christmas Eve 2013 robbed the world of someone who was making it a better place, and that loss can never be fully calculated or recovered. At the same time, Brandon's case illustrates the complex realities of serious mental illness, particularly when it emerges during the vulnerable teenage years. The honor roll student and star athlete who committed matricide was not evil in the traditional sense, but rather someone whose mind had been hijacked by illness, leading to consequences that were tragic for everyone involved. The legal system's response to Brandon's case, finding him not guilty by reason of insanity and committing him to long-term mental health treatment, reflects an attempt to balance justice with compassion, punishment with healing. This approach acknowledges that while Brandon committed a terrible crime, he did so while in the grip of severe mental illness that had compromised his ability to distinguish right from wrong. Over the years since the murder, Brandon's treatment and gradual progress toward rehabilitation illustrate both the possibilities and the limitations of mental health care. With appropriate medication, therapy, and support, someone who has committed violence while mentally ill can potentially recover and develop the insight and coping skills necessary to prevent future violence. This doesn't diminish the tragedy of what happened to Sharon, nor does it guarantee that similar cases will always have positive outcomes. Mental illness and violence remain complex, unpredictable phenomena that challenge our understanding and our systems of care and justice. The case also highlights the importance of mental health awareness and early intervention. While it's impossible to know whether earlier recognition and treatment of Brandon's mental illness could have prevented Sharon's murder, cases like this underscore the critical need for better mental health resources, particularly for teenagers and young adults. For families dealing with mental illness, Brandon's story serves as both a warning and a source of hope. It reminds us that mental illness can have devastating consequences if left untreated, but also that recovery and rehabilitation are possible with appropriate care and support. The community of Gulf Breeze, meanwhile, has had to grapple with the reality that tragedy can strike anywhere, even in the most peaceful and seemingly safe places. The case has likely changed how residents think about mental illness, family violence, and the importance of supporting those who are struggling with psychological challenges. Perhaps most importantly, Sharon's story reminds us of the ripple effects of a life well lived. Even in death, she continues to be remembered as someone who made a difference, who touched lives in positive ways, and who represents the best of what it means to be a teacher, a mother, and a member of a community. As we reflect on this tragic case, we're reminded that life is precious and fragile, that mental illness is a serious medical condition that requires understanding and treatment, and that even in the face of unthinkable tragedy, there can be paths toward healing and hope. Every Christmas Eve since 2013, as families across Gulf Breeze gather to celebrate the holiday, there are those who remember Sharon Adelot. Her former students, now grown, might think of the teacher who believed in them when they struggled to believe in themselves. Her colleagues remember a dedicated educator who stayed late to help students and always had an encouraging word for those who needed it most. The case of Sharon Adelot and Brandon serves as a reminder of the complexity of human nature, the reality of mental illness, and the importance of compassion in the face of tragedy. It's a story without easy answers, but one that offers lessons about the need for mental health awareness, the possibility of rehabilitation, and the enduring impact of a life dedicated to helping others. As Brandon continues his journey of recovery and rehabilitation, and as Sharon's family and community continue their process of healing, the story serves as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the human capacity for growth, understanding, and hope, even in the aftermath of unthinkable tragedy. In the quiet coastal town of Gulf Breeze, where the waters of the Gulf of Mexico continue to lap against pristine shores, life goes on. Children attend the school where Sharon once taught, families gather for holidays, and the community continues to embody the values of kindness and caring that Sharon represented. Her legacy lives on not in the manner of her death, but in the impact of her life, in the students she taught, the colleagues she inspired, and the reminder that even in our darkest moments, there are those who dedicate themselves to making the world a little brighter, a little kinder, and a little better for everyone they meet. And perhaps, in that legacy, there is both remembrance and hope for the future. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we journey to the quiet suburbs of Winter Park, Florida, where tree-lined streets and well-maintained homes create the picture of suburban tranquility. It was September 2017, and the morning sun filtered through the Spanish moss as residents went about their daily routines, unaware that darkness was about to shatter their peaceful community. This is the story of Jennifer Lynn Fulford, a 56-year-old woman whose life was built on caring for others. For 6 or 7 years, she had served as both nanny and personal assistant to a Winter Park family, becoming not just an employee, but a trusted member of their household. Jennifer was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who stayed late when needed, who treated the children in her care as if they were her own. On September 27, 2017, Jennifer's employer waited at the school pickup line, checking her watch with growing concern. Jennifer was never late. She was the type of person who arrived early, prepared, reliable to a fault. But as minutes turned to an hour, then 2, a cold dread began to settle over the family. Something was terribly wrong. The morning of September 27 had started like any other in the Fulford household in Altamonte Springs. Jennifer went through her morning routine with the methodical care that defined her approach to life. She gathered her purse, checked her schedule, and made her way to work at the Winter Park home where she had become such an integral part of the family's daily rhythm. The house sat quietly in the established neighborhood, where mature oaks cast long shadows across manicured lawns. Jennifer let herself in, as she had done countless times before, ready to begin another day of caring for the family she had grown to love. The house was peaceful, almost serene in the morning light filtering through the windows. But somewhere in those quiet morning hours, evil found its way to Jennifer Fulford's world. When the school called to ask where Jennifer was, her employer felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Jennifer would never simply not show up. She would never leave a child waiting at school. The employer rushed home, heart pounding with each turn of the familiar streets. Walking through her own front door, the employer immediately sensed something was wrong. The house felt different somehow, disturbed. Then she found it, Jennifer's purse, sitting abandoned in the bathroom. Her keys, her identification, her life left behind like a discarded costume. The Winter Park Police Department received the missing person report that afternoon. Detective after detective had handled cases like this before, adults who disappeared, usually of their own accord, usually turning up within days with explanations that ranged from embarrassing to mundane. But this case felt different from the start. Jennifer Fulford wasn't the type to disappear. She had roots, responsibilities, people who depended on her. Her car was missing, a detail that could suggest she had left voluntarily, but her purse remained behind, which painted a more sinister picture. In the careful mathematics of missing persons cases, the equation didn't add up to a voluntary departure. The Winter Park police began their investigation with the methodical precision that marks the difference between solved and unsolved cases. They canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed neighbors, and began the painstaking process of tracing Jennifer's last known movements. Security cameras became their best witnesses. In a world where privacy has largely given way to surveillance, investigators found themselves able to trace Jennifer's car through the streets of Central Florida like following breadcrumbs through a dark forest. The Toyota moved through frame after frame, carrying its unwilling passenger toward an unknown fate. The first major breakthrough came when they tracked the car to a Publix grocery store. There, captured on grainy security footage, was a man emerging from Jennifer's vehicle. He moved with purpose, not the frantic energy of panic, but the deliberate steps of someone executing a plan. He crossed the parking lot, walked to the street, and boarded a city bus as if he were simply another commuter heading home from errands. But this man's errands had been far from ordinary. The investigation team pulled the bus surveillance footage and followed their suspect through the transit system. Modern police work often resembles a digital puzzle, piecing together fragments of electronic evidence to reconstruct events. They obtained ATM footage showing someone using Jennifer's bank card, withdrawing $300 from her account. The same man from the Publix parking lot, now revealed more clearly in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the bank's exterior. With facial recognition technology and old-fashioned detective work, they identified their suspect, Scott Edward Nelson, a 31-year-old man with a criminal history that read like a roadmap of escalating violence. Nelson was on federal parole, supposedly supervised, supposedly rehabilitated, supposedly no longer a threat to society. The mathematics of criminal justice had failed Jennifer Fulford. Scott Nelson's life story was written in police reports and parole violations, a narrative of choices that led inevitably toward violence. Born into circumstances that would challenge anyone's moral compass, Nelson had navigated childhood and young adulthood accumulating arrests, convictions, and release dates that marked time like a metronome counting down to catastrophe. He had been in and out of the federal prison system, serving sentences for crimes that grew progressively more serious. Each release came with conditions: check in with parole officers, maintain employment, avoid certain areas and certain people. The system was designed to provide structure, support, and supervision for those trying to rebuild their lives after incarceration. But for Scott Nelson, the system represented something else entirely. In his mind, it was a network of people with power over him, people who had what he wanted, people who reminded him daily of everything he lacked. The comfortable homes he was required to avoid, the steady employment he was required to maintain, the normal life that seemed always just beyond his reach. By September 2017, Nelson had been living in Orlando, checking in with his federal parole officer, and growing increasingly resentful of the world around him. Later, during his trial, a chilling picture would emerge of a man consumed by envy and rage, someone who looked at people like Jennifer Fulford and saw not a hard-working woman building a life through dedication and service, but someone who had everything, while he had nothing. On the morning of September 27, 2017, Nelson made a decision that would destroy multiple lives, including his own. He would later claim that his parole officer was responsible for his actions, that the system had turned him into an animal. But the evidence would tell a different story, the story of a man who chose violence when faced with the daily reminder of his own failures. The exact sequence of events that morning may never be fully known, but investigators and prosecutors would eventually piece together enough evidence to paint a horrifying picture of Jennifer Fulford's final hours. Nelson had somehow gained entry to the Winter Park home where Jennifer worked. Whether through deception, force, or simply walking through an unlocked door, he found himself face to face with a woman who represented everything he believed he deserved but could never have. Jennifer, in those first moments, likely tried to de-escalate whatever situation she found herself in. Those who knew her described a woman who was naturally caring, someone who would try to help even a stranger in distress. She may have offered him food, money, whatever he seemed to need. It was the kind of person she was, someone who saw need and tried to fill it. But Scott Nelson hadn't come looking for help. He had come looking for something to take. At some point that morning, Jennifer Fulford realized she was in mortal danger. Nelson bound her hands and feet, using materials he had brought or found in the house. He covered her face with duct tape, so tightly that it would become difficult for her to breathe. Then he forced her into the trunk of her own car and drove away from the only safety she had known. The drive through Orlando's streets must have been a nightmare of claustrophobia and terror for Jennifer. Curled in the darkness of her own trunk, hands and feet bound, breathing made difficult by the tape across her face, she was completely at the mercy of a man who had shown her none. Nelson drove to several locations that day. First, he took Jennifer to an ATM, using her bank card to withdraw $300 from her account. The security cameras captured him in the act, but he seemed unconcerned about being recorded. Perhaps he already knew that Jennifer would never be in a position to report the theft. Then he drove to a vacant field in southwest Orange County, a desolate area where the suburban development gave way to undeveloped land. There, in a place where no one could hear her scream, Scott Nelson murdered Jennifer Fulford. The medical examiner would later determine that Jennifer had been stabbed multiple times and suffocated. The duct tape across her face had been applied so tightly that it restricted her breathing to the point of asphyxiation. She died alone, in pain, at the hands of a stranger who had decided her life was worth less than the $300 in her bank account. After killing Jennifer, Nelson wrapped her body and left it in the wooded area. Then he drove her car to the Publix parking lot, abandoned it, and calmly walked away as if he had simply completed an errand. For 3 days, Jennifer Fulford lay undiscovered in the Orange County woods while her family, friends, and co-workers hoped against hope that she might still be alive. Missing person flyers appeared on telephone poles and in store windows. Social media filled with pleas for information. A $5,000 reward was offered for any information leading to Jennifer's whereabouts. The Winter Park police continued their investigation, following the digital trail that Nelson had inadvertently left behind. They tracked him through surveillance footage, ATM records, and witness statements from bus drivers and store employees. Slowly, methodically, they built a case against their primary suspect. On September 30th, 3 days after Jennifer disappeared, investigators following up on their leads made the discovery that everyone had feared but no one had wanted to acknowledge. In a wooded area in southwest Orange County, they found Jennifer's body. The scene was everything the investigators had hoped they wouldn't find. Jennifer lay bound and wrapped, discarded like refuse in a place where she might never have been discovered if not for the methodical police work that had led them there. The knife that had taken her life was found nearby, bearing DNA evidence that would link it definitively to both the victim and her killer. The medical examiner's report would later detail the full extent of Jennifer's suffering in her final hours. The multiple stab wounds, the suffocation, the evidence of her desperate struggle to survive. It painted a picture of a woman who had fought to live, who had endured unimaginable terror, and who had ultimately succumbed to violence that was as senseless as it was brutal. Scott Nelson was arrested on October 3, 2017, less than a week after Jennifer Fulford's disappearance. The evidence against him was overwhelming: surveillance footage, ATM records, DNA evidence, and witness testimony all pointed to his guilt. He had left a digital and physical trail that investigators were able to follow with relative ease. But Nelson's arrest was just the beginning of a legal process that would take nearly 2 years to complete. He was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, carjacking, and robbery. The state of Florida would eventually seek the death penalty, arguing that the crime was both premeditated and committed in the course of other felonies. During his time in jail awaiting trial, Nelson would speak with investigators, and his statements would reveal the true depth of his resentment and entitlement. He spoke about being tired of seeing people who had everything while he had nothing. He blamed his parole officer, the system, society itself for his actions. He painted himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. But investigators saw something different in Scott Nelson. They saw a man who had made a series of choices that led inevitably to violence. They saw someone who had decided that his wants and needs were more important than another person's right to live. The evidence they had gathered told the story of a crime that was both impulsive and calculated. Nelson had brought materials to bind Jennifer, suggesting some degree of planning. But his subsequent actions, using her ATM card on camera, abandoning her car in a public place, taking public transportation home, suggested a man who hadn't thought through the consequences of his actions. When Scott Nelson's trial began in June 2019, nearly 2 years after Jennifer's murder, the courtroom was filled with people whose lives had been forever changed by his actions. Jennifer's family and friends, the family she had worked for, law enforcement officers who had worked the case, and members of the community who had been shaken by the random nature of her death. The prosecution presented a methodical case, walking the jury through the timeline of events from Jennifer's disappearance to the discovery of her body. They showed surveillance footage of Nelson using Jennifer's ATM card, abandoning her car, and boarding the bus. They presented DNA evidence linking him to the murder weapon. They called witnesses who testified about Jennifer's character and the impact of her loss. The evidence was overwhelming, but prosecutor Caroline Hicks wanted the jury to understand not just what had happened, but why it mattered. She painted a picture of Jennifer as someone who had dedicated her life to caring for others, someone who had built a life based on service and kindness. She described the terror Jennifer must have felt in her final hours, bound and helpless at the mercy of a man who had decided her life was worthless. The defense, led by Nelson's attorneys, faced the difficult task of defending a client whose guilt seemed evident. They couldn't dispute the physical evidence or the timeline of events. Instead, they focused on Nelson's mental state and his troubled background. They argued that while he may have committed the crime, he was not fully responsible for his actions due to mental illness and the failure of the system that was supposed to supervise him. But then Scott Nelson made a decision that would define the rest of the trial. Against his attorney's advice, he chose to take the stand in his own defense. When Scott Nelson took the witness stand on June 27, 2019, the courtroom fell silent. It's relatively rare for defendants in murder cases to testify on their own behalf, particularly when the evidence against them is as strong as it was in this case. But Nelson seemed to believe he could explain his actions in a way that would somehow justify or excuse what he had done. What followed was a display of narcissism and blame shifting that would be remarkable if it weren't so tragic. Nelson admitted to killing Jennifer Fulford, but he refused to accept responsibility for his actions. Instead, he blamed his federal parole officer, claiming that the supervision he was under had turned him into an animal. He told the jury that he was tired of seeing people who had more than he did, people who lived in nice houses and drove nice cars while he struggled to get by. He described Jennifer Fulford not as a hard-working woman who had earned her place in the world through dedication and service, but as someone who had everything while he had nothing. Nelson's testimony revealed a worldview that was both self-pitying and deeply entitled. He saw himself as the victim of a system that had failed him, rather than as someone who had repeatedly made choices that hurt others. He seemed genuinely to believe that his circumstances justified his actions, that his resentment and envy gave him the right to take what he wanted, including Jennifer's life. The prosecution's cross-examination was devastating. Prosecutor Caroline Hicks methodically dismantled Nelson's attempts to shift blame, forcing him to acknowledge the choices he had made and the planning that had gone into Jennifer's murder. She pointed out that many people face difficult circumstances without resorting to violence, that his supervision was meant to help him, not harm him. But perhaps most powerfully, Hicks forced Nelson to confront the reality of what he had done to Jennifer. She made him acknowledge that Jennifer had been a real person with a real life, not just a symbol of everything he thought he deserved. She made him admit that his victim had suffered, that she had died in terror and pain because of choices he had made. By the time Nelson left the witness stand, any sympathy the jury might have felt for his circumstances had been overshadowed by revulsion at his complete lack of remorse or genuine responsibility. On June 28, 2019, after deliberating for several hours, the jury returned their verdict. Scott Nelson was found guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, carjacking, and robbery. The evidence had been too overwhelming, Nelson's own testimony too damning, for any other outcome. But in Florida, a conviction for first-degree murder is just the beginning of the legal process when the death penalty is on the table. The same jury that had convicted Nelson would now have to decide whether he should be executed or sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The penalty phase of the trial focused on the aggravating and mitigating factors in the case. The prosecution argued that the murder had been particularly heinous, atrocious, and cruel, that it had been committed during the course of other felonies, and that Nelson posed a continuing threat to society. They painted a picture of a crime so brutal and senseless that only the ultimate penalty would be appropriate. The defense, meanwhile, presented evidence about Nelson's troubled background, his mental health issues, and the failures of the system that was supposed to supervise him. They argued that while his crime was terrible, it didn't rise to the level of the worst murders that might merit the death penalty. The jury deliberated for hours over whether Scott Nelson should live or die. They weighed the horror of Jennifer's final hours against the possibility that Nelson might someday find redemption. They considered the impact on Jennifer's family and friends, the message that their verdict would send to the community, and the ultimate question of whether the state should take a life in response to a life taken. On July 11, 2019, the jury returned with their recommendation: life in prison without the possibility of parole. They had decided that while Nelson deserved to be punished for the rest of his life, execution was not the appropriate response to his crime. The decision was not unanimous. Florida law requires only a majority of jurors to recommend death, but it was decisive enough to spare Nelson's life while ensuring he would never again be free to hurt anyone. On October 23, 2024, more than 7 years after Jennifer Fulford's murder, Scott Nelson was finally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The long delay between conviction and sentencing is not uncommon in capital cases, as appeals and procedural requirements can drag on for years. Judge Patricia Strobridge, who presided over the sentencing, spoke about the impact of the crime not just on Jennifer's family, but on the broader community. She noted that Jennifer had been someone who dedicated her life to caring for others, and that her loss had been felt by everyone who knew her. The judge also addressed Nelson directly, making it clear that his attempts to blame others for his actions had not been convincing. She noted that many people face difficult circumstances without resorting to violence, and that his choice to murder Jennifer Fulford had been exactly that, a choice. For Jennifer's family and friends, the sentencing brought a measure of closure to a process that had dragged on for years. While nothing could bring Jennifer back, knowing that her killer would spend the rest of his life in prison provided some small comfort in the face of their irreplaceable loss. The family had waded through the investigation, the arrests, the delays, the trial, the appeals, and finally the sentencing. At each stage, they had been forced to relive Jennifer's final hours, to hear details about her suffering, to sit in the same room as the man who had taken her life. The criminal justice system, for all its necessity, is often a brutal experience for the families of victims. But they had persevered, determined to see that Jennifer received the justice she deserved. Their presence throughout the legal proceeding served as a reminder that Jennifer had been more than just a victim. She had been a daughter, a friend, a caregiver who had made the world a little better through her presence. The murder of Jennifer Fulford sent shockwaves through the Winter Park community and beyond. It was the kind of crime that shattered assumptions about safety and security, the random act of violence that reminds us all of our vulnerability. For the family Jennifer had worked for, the loss was both professional and deeply personal. She had been caring for their children, managing their household, becoming part of their daily routine and their extended family. Her absence left not just logistical challenges, but an emotional void that would never be completely filled. The children she had cared for faced the particular trauma of losing someone who had been a constant, nurturing presence in their lives. For young people, the sudden absence of a caregiver can be especially devastating, challenging their sense of safety and permanence in the world. For Jennifer's colleagues in the domestic service industry, her murder was a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities they faced. Many people who work as nannies, housekeepers, and personal assistants work alone in other people's homes, often without the security measures that protect employees in more traditional workplace settings. The case also highlighted broader questions about the supervision of federal parolees and the support systems available to people re-entering society after incarceration. While Nelson's attempts to blame his parole officer were rightly rejected by the jury, his case did raise questions about whether the current system of supervision and support is adequate to prevent future tragedies. Jennifer Fulford's legacy lives on in the memories of those who knew her and in the lives she touched during her 56 years. She was remembered not as a victim, but as someone who had chosen to spend her life caring for others, who had found meaning and purpose in service. The family she worked for established a scholarship fund in her memory, ensuring that her commitment to nurturing young people would continue even after her death. Friends and colleagues shared stories about her kindness, her reliability, and her genuine care for the children she supervised. But perhaps Jennifer's most important legacy is the reminder she provides about the value of ordinary kindness. In a world that often celebrates the spectacular and the sensational, Jennifer's life was built on small acts of care and daily dedication to others. She represents the countless people who make the world better not through grand gestures, but through consistent, compassionate service. Her murder also serves as a reminder about the random nature of violence and the importance of taking reasonable precautions without allowing fear to dominate our lives. Jennifer's death was not the result of any mistake she made or any risk she took. It was simply the tragic result of being in the wrong place when a dangerous person decided to act on his violent impulses. The case of Jennifer Fulford raises profound questions about justice, punishment, and redemption. Scott Nelson was clearly guilty of a terrible crime, but his case also highlighted the complex factors that can lead someone toward violence. Nelson's troubled background, his history of incarceration, and his struggles with reintegration into society don't excuse his actions, but they do provide context for understanding how such tragedies occur. His case illustrates both the importance of supporting people who are trying to rebuild their lives after incarceration and the reality that some people will choose violence regardless of the support they receive. The jury's decision to recommend life in prison rather than death reflects a nuanced understanding of justice that goes beyond simple retribution. While Nelson clearly deserved severe punishment for his crime, the jury apparently concluded that execution was not necessary to protect society or provide appropriate consequences for his actions. For many people, the distinction between life in prison and the death penalty may seem academic. Nelson will spend the rest of his life behind bars regardless of which sentence he received. But the jury's decision reflects important principles about the value of life and the limits of state power, even in response to terrible crimes. While Scott Nelson was convicted and sentenced for Jennifer Fulford's murder, some questions about the case remain unanswered. Investigators never fully determined how Nelson gained access to the Winter Park home where Jennifer worked, or whether he had been surveillanced the property or the family beforehand. The randomness of the crime, the apparent lack of any connection between Nelson and Jennifer before that September morning, makes it particularly haunting. It suggests that Jennifer's death was the result of nothing more than terrible timing, being in the wrong place when a dangerous person decided to act on his violent impulses. This randomness is both comforting and terrifying. It's comforting because it suggests that Jennifer did nothing wrong, took no unreasonable risks, made no mistakes that contributed to her death. But it's terrifying because it reminds us all that we are potentially vulnerable to similar random acts of violence. Law enforcement officials continue to recommend basic safety precautions for people who work alone, particularly those who work in other people's homes. These include staying in communication with family or employers, being aware of surroundings, and trusting instincts about potentially dangerous situations. But the reality is that no amount of precaution can eliminate all risk. Jennifer Fulford's murder serves as a reminder that we live in a world where dangerous people sometimes commit terrible acts, and that our safety depends not just on our own vigilance, but on the broader systems of law enforcement and criminal justice that work to identify and contain threats to public safety. As we come to the end of Jennifer Fulford's story, we're left with the eternal questions that follow every senseless tragedy. Why do some people choose violence when faced with life's challenges? How do we balance compassion for those who have made mistakes with the need to protect innocent people from harm? What can we learn from cases like this that might help prevent future tragedies? There are no easy answers to these questions. Jennifer's murder was the result of one man's decision to value his own wants above another person's life. Scott Nelson chose to see Jennifer as an obstacle to what he wanted rather than as a fellow human being deserving of respect and compassion. But Jennifer's life reminds us of the alternative path that most people choose. Faced with challenges and disappointments, she chose service over selfishness. She built a life based on caring for others, on reliability and kindness, on making the world a little better through her daily actions. In the end, that may be Jennifer Fulford's most important legacy, not the manner of her death, but the example of her life. She showed us what it looks like to find meaning and purpose in caring for others, to build relationships based on trust and service, to approach each day with dedication to making life better for the people around us. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll remember Jennifer not as a victim of violence, but as an example of the kind of person we all aspire to be, someone who chooses kindness over cruelty, service over selfishness, love over hate. In a world that sometimes seems dominated by darkness, people like Jennifer Fulford remind us that light still exists, and that each of us has the power to add a little more light to the world through our own choices and actions. Her story ends in tragedy, but her life stands as testimony to the power of ordinary goodness, the value of consistent care, and the difference that one person can make through a lifetime of small acts of love. May we all find the courage to follow her example, and may her memory be a blessing to all who knew her. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.